Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the remote Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve in the Flint Hills of Kansas, where endless waves of prairie grass stretched toward horizons that seemed to mock the very concept of escape. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day camping trip. Just me, my boyfriend, Marcus, and our 2 friends from the office, Derek and Amanda. We'd all been working 60-hour weeks at the insurance firm, and Marcus had suggested we needed to reconnect with nature and unplug from the digital noise. I remember rolling my eyes at his pseudo-philosophical bullshit, but the idea of getting away from Kansas City's suffocating suburban sprawl appealed to me. Marcus had found this supposedly secluded spot near the old Cottonwood Falls area, where the National Preserve met private ranch land. Off the beaten path, he'd said with that smug grin that made me question why I was still dating him after 2 years. No cell towers, no tourists, just us and the prairie. The drive out had taken longer than expected. Our GPS kept glitching once we left the main highway, showing us in impossible locations, sometimes in the middle of ponds, sometimes 20 miles north of where we'd just been. Derek, ever the practical joker, suggested we were entering the Twilight Zone, complete with the theme song hummed through his nose. Amanda laughed, but I noticed her knuckles were white as she gripped the passenger seat. We finally found the access road Marcus had marked on his paper map, an actual paper map, because he'd insisted on doing this the old-fashioned way. The road was little more than 2 tire tracks cutting through chest-high blue-stem grass, flanked by scattered cottonwoods whose leaves whispered secrets I didn't want to hear. The campsite sat in a small clearing beside Cottonwood Creek, which was really just a muddy trickle that summer. Ancient limestone outcroppings jutted from the earth like broken teeth, and the air carried the sweet, cloying scent of prairie roses mixed with something else. Something organic and wrong that reminded me of the smell that lingered in my grandmother's house after she died and wasn't found for 3 days. "This is perfect," Marcus declared, spreading his arms wide like he was embracing the entire prairie. "Look at this view. Look at all this space." Space. That's what bothered me immediately. Too much space. The prairie stretched in every direction, broken only by occasional stands of trees that looked like dark islands in an ocean of grass. The sky overhead was enormous, pressing down with its vastness until I felt like an ant under a magnifying glass. My chest tightened. A feeling I'd experienced since childhood whenever I found myself in wide-open spaces with nowhere to hide. We set up camp as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Marcus and Derek erected their tent with military precision, while Amanda and I struggled with ours, the wind constantly catching the fabric and snapping it like a flag. Every gust brought new scents: dust, dried grass, and underneath it all, that persistent smell of decay. "Anyone else notice how quiet it is?" Amanda asked as we finished securing our rainfly. She was right. No birds, no insects. No cattle lowing in the distance. Just the endless whisper of grass and the occasional crack of settling limestone. "It's peaceful," Marcus called out, but his voice carried a defensive edge. He'd planned this trip, researched the location, and he wasn't about to admit it felt wrong. Derek emerged from their tent with a beer already open. "Come on, ladies. We're here to relax. Let's get a fire going and forget about the real world for a while." The fire proved problematic from the start. Despite the abundance of deadfall from the cottonwoods, every piece of wood we collected seemed damp, even though it hadn't rained in weeks according to the weather reports. The flames would catch, burn low and blue instead of orange, then die out for no apparent reason. Marcus grew increasingly frustrated, muttering about defective matches and humidity that doesn't make sense. When we finally got a proper fire established, it cast strange shadows on the limestone outcroppings, making them look like crouching figures watching us from the darkness beyond our small circle of light. I tried to shake off the feeling of being observed, but every time I looked up from the flames, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shapes that vanished when I turned my head. "So what's the plan for tomorrow?" Amanda asked, her voice too bright, too forced. She was feeling it too, the wrongness that seemed to seep from the very ground beneath us. "I thought we'd explore some of the old ranch roads," Marcus said, consulting his map by firelight. "There's supposed to be some really interesting geological formations about 5 miles northeast of here. And Derek found something about a ghost town called Elmdale that's supposed to be completely abandoned." Derek nodded, tipping his beer bottle toward the darkness. "Founded in 1879, died out during the Dust Bowl. Supposedly, there's still some buildings standing, including an old schoolhouse and a church." The mention of abandoned places made my skin crawl, but I forced a smile. "Sounds like fun." We talked for another hour, the conversation gradually dying as the prairie night settled around us. The fire burned lower despite our efforts to feed it, and the darkness beyond our camp seemed to press closer. Finally, we decided to turn in, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the grass. I woke sometime after midnight to the sound of footsteps circling our tent. The steps were slow, deliberate, crushing the dried grass with a wet, organic sound that made my throat tighten with revulsion. I lay perfectly still, listening as whatever it was made a complete circuit around our campsite. The footsteps paused at each tent, and I could swear I heard breathing, deep, ragged inhalations that seemed to go on forever. Amanda was awake too, I could tell by the tension in her breathing. We lay there in the darkness, afraid to move, afraid to speak, as the thing outside continued its patrol. The footsteps stopped directly outside our tent, and I heard a sound that still haunts my dreams. A wet, snuffling noise, like a dog following a scent, but deeper, more deliberate. Then, silence. I must have dozed eventually because I woke to Amanda shaking my shoulder. Daylight filtered through the tent fabric, and the sounds of normal morning activities, birds calling, wind in the grass, had returned. "Did you hear anything last night?" she whispered. "Footsteps," I admitted. "Something walking around the camp." Her face went pale. It wasn't just me then. We emerged from the tent to find Marcus already up, poking at the remains of our fire. The ashes were cold, which was strange because we'd banked it with enough coals to last until morning. Derek was nowhere to be seen. "Where's Derek?" Amanda asked. Marcus shrugged. "Probably off taking a piss. You know how he is. Never can wait for everyone else to wake up." But Derek didn't return. We waited through breakfast, calling his name across the prairie. Our voices seemed to disappear into the grass, swallowed by the vastness. Finally, Marcus suggested we split up to look for him. "He probably just wandered off to explore," he said, but I caught the worry in his voice. "We'll cover more ground if we spread out." Against my better judgment, I found myself walking alone through the tall grass, following what might have been a game trail toward a distant stand of cottonwoods. The morning sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat soaked through my shirt within minutes. But what bothered me more was the silence. As I moved further from camp, even the whisper of wind through grass faded, leaving me in a bubble of absolute quiet that made my ears ring. I found Derek about half a mile from camp, standing motionless beside the creek. "Derek," I called, relief flooding through me. "We've been looking everywhere for you." He didn't respond. As I got closer, I could see he was staring down into the muddy water, his back rigid, shoulders unnaturally square. Something about his posture sent ice through my veins. "Derek?" I approached slowly, the way you might approach a spooked animal. "Are you okay?" He turned toward me and I nearly screamed. His face was Derek's face, but wrong in ways that my brain struggled to process. His smile was too wide, stretching his mouth in a rictus that showed too many teeth. His eyes blinked rarely, and when they did, It was with a slow, deliberate motion that reminded me of a lizard. Most disturbing of all, he'd lost weight. Not gradually, but dramatically, as if something had hollowed him out from the inside. His clothes hung loose on his frame, and his skin had taken on a grayish pallor that spoke of sickness or death. "Jennifer," he said, and his voice was Derek's voice but flattened, emotionless. "I was waiting for you." "Waiting for me?" My throat felt constricted. "Derek, what's wrong? You look different?" He tilted his head at an angle that was almost 90 degrees, still wearing that terrible smile. "I feel different, better, hungry." I backed away, every instinct screaming danger. We should get back to camp. Marcus and Amanda are worried. "Yes," Derek agreed, straightening his head with a wet popping sound. "Let's go back to camp." The walk back was a nightmare of normality. Derek chatted about the weather, about work, about mundane things, but his voice never varied in tone or inflection. He'd forgotten Amanda's middle name, something he'd teased her about just yesterday. He referred to Marcus as Mike twice, and he kept smiling that horrible too-wide smile. Marcus and Amanda were packing gear when we returned, clearly preparing to search for Derek themselves. Their relief at seeing him was palpable, but I watched their faces change as they got a better look at him. "Jesus, Derek," Amanda said. "You look like shit. Are you feeling okay?" "I feel wonderful," Derek replied with that same flat affect. "Never better." Marcus frowned. "Where were you, man? We were starting to worry." "Exploring," Derek said. "There's so much to see here, so much to experience." Over the next few hours, Derek's behavior became increasingly disturbing. He volunteered to gather firewood and returned with armloads of branches that were clearly rotten, crawling with insects. When Marcus pointed this out, Derek stared at him for a long moment before dropping the wood and walking away without a word. He sat apart from us during lunch, not eating, just watching us with those unblinking eyes. When Amanda tried to engage him in conversation about the ghost town we'd planned to visit, he showed no interest. When she mentioned a funny story from work, he laughed, a sound like breaking glass that made us all flinch. "I think Derek might be sick," I whispered to Marcus when Derek wandered off toward the creek again. "He's acting really strange." "It's probably just the heat," Marcus replied, but I could see the worry in his eyes. "Some people don't handle being away from civilization very well, but it wasn't the heat, and we all knew it. Something fundamental had changed in Derek overnight, something that went deeper than illness or discomfort." As evening approached and we prepared dinner, he returned to camp carrying something wrapped in his shirt. "I brought meat," he announced with evident pride. Marcus accepted the bundle before any of us could stop him, then immediately dropped it with a curse. Inside the shirt was something that might have been a rabbit, but it had been torn apart with teeth and claws, partially eaten, and was crawling with maggots despite the fact that it couldn't have been dead for more than a few hours. "What the fuck, Derek?" Marcus shouted, wiping his hands frantically on his jeans. "This thing is rotten." Derek's smile faltered for the first time since I'd found him by the creek. "It's fresh. I killed it myself." "With what?" Amanda demanded. "Your bare hands." Derek tilted his head again, considering the question. "Yes." That night, none of us slept. We huddled in our tents, listening to Derek moving around the campsite. He'd refused to sleep in his tent, claiming he preferred to keep watch. Through the thin fabric, we could see his silhouette pacing the perimeter of our camp, sometimes stopping to stare in a particular direction for long minutes before resuming his patrol. Around 3 a.m., Amanda grabbed my arm so hard I nearly cried out. "Look," she whispered. Through the mesh window of our tent, I could see Derek crouched beside the remains of our fire. He was eating something, tearing at it with his teeth, making wet, satisfied sounds. In the moonlight, I could see dark stains around his mouth. "We have to leave," Amanda whispered. "First thing in the morning, we pack up and get the hell out of here." I nodded, unable to speak. Whatever Derek had become during his night away from camp, It wasn't human anymore. Dawn came with a blood-red sunrise that painted the prairie the color of rust. Derek was gone when we emerged from our tents, but the area around the dead fire was littered with small bones and tufts of fur. Marcus found our food supplies scattered and partially consumed, packages torn open and contents devoured, including things that weren't meant to be eaten, like soap and matches. "We're leaving," Marcus announced, his voice shaky but determined. "Right now. We'll find Derek and make him come with us, or we'll send help back for him." Packing took longer than it should have. Our gear seemed to have been moved during the night, scattered in ways that made no sense. My backpack was hanging from a cottonwood branch 15 feet off the ground. Amanda's sleeping bag was found buried in the creek mud. Marcus's compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. We were loading the last of our gear into the car when Derek emerged from the tall grass, moving with a strange, loping gait that reminded me of a wolf. He was naked from the waist up, his chest and arms covered in scratches and what looked like bite marks. His mouth was stained dark with something I didn't want to identify. "Leaving?" he asked, and his voice had changed again. Deeper now, with an odd resonance that seemed to come from somewhere other than his throat. "We're all leaving," Marcus said firmly. "Get your stuff, Derek. We're going home." Derek laughed, that horrible glass-breaking sound. "This is home now. Can't you feel it? The hunger? The freedom?" He took a step toward us, and I saw that his fingernails had grown into claws. His teeth, when he smiled, were pointed and stained with blood. "You can't leave," he said conversationally. "It won't let you." As if summoned by his words, our car engine died with a wheeze. Marcus turned the key frantically, but nothing happened. The battery was dead, the radio silent, even though the car had been running fine just moments before. "What did you do?" Marcus demanded, stepping toward Derek with his fists clenched. Derek's head tilted again, that unnatural 90-degree angle. "I didn't do anything, but it's hungry, and you smell so warm." That's when I saw them. Shapes moving through the grass around us, circling our campsite with predatory patience. At first I thought they were animals, wolves maybe, but as they drew closer I realized they walked upright. They were gaunt, emaciated figures with two long limbs and faces that were almost human but stretched and distorted, as if someone had taken a person and pulled them apart like taffy. "Wendigo," Amanda whispered, and the word carried the weight of old nightmares. Childhood stories told to keep children close to home after dark. Derek smiled wider, his jaw unhinging like a snake's. They've been waiting so long for visitors. Waiting and starving and dreaming of warm flesh and hot blood flowing down hungry throats. The creatures moved closer and I could smell them now, the stench of death and decay and unimaginable hunger. Their eyes were holes in their skulls, and their mouths were filled with broken glass teeth. Marcus grabbed a piece of firewood and swung it at the nearest creature. The branch passed harmlessly through its body and it laughed, a sound like wind through empty ribs. "You can't fight them," Derek said, and his voice was changing again, becoming deeper, more resonant, inhuman. "They're part of the prairie now, part of the hunger that lives in empty places." One of the creatures reached out with fingers like broken sticks and touched Amanda's face. She screamed and collapsed, convulsing as black veins spread from the point of contact across her skin. Within seconds, she was still, her eyes rolled back to show only white. Then she sat up, smiled Derek's terrible smile, and said, "I'm so hungry." Marcus ran. I watched him sprint toward the car, fumbling with keys that wouldn't work, then abandon it and head for the tall grass. The creatures flowed after him like smoke, and his screams echoed across the prairie for what felt like hours before cutting off abruptly. I was alone with Derek and the thing that had been Amanda. They stood on either side of me, close enough that I could feel the unnatural cold radiating from their bodies. "It doesn't hurt," Derek said gently, almost kindly. "The hunger takes away all the pain, all the fear, all the loneliness." Amanda nodded, her movements jerky and puppet-like. "Join us, Jennifer. You'll never be alone again." I thought about running, but where could I go? The prairie stretched endlessly in every direction, and the creatures moved through it like sharks through water. I thought about fighting, but what could I do against things that weren't entirely real? Instead, I closed my eyes and remembered my grandmother's stories. The old tales she'd told me about evil spirits and how to survive them. "Iron," she'd said. "Cold iron and running water and the names of God." I didn't have iron, but I had something else. In my backpack, wrapped in a cloth at the bottom, my grandmother's silver crucifix, the one she'd worn every day of her life until the cancer finally claimed her. Moving slowly, trying not to attract attention, I reached into my pack. Derek and Amanda watched with curious, predatory interest, but they didn't try to stop me. Maybe they thought I was looking for food or water, some last human comfort before joining their hungry communion. My fingers found the cloth bundle, and I felt the familiar weight of the crucifix. It was warm, warmer than it should have been after sitting in my pack all day. I pulled it out and held it up, and the effect was immediate. Derek shrieked and staggered backward, his face contorting into something that was no longer even remotely human. The creatures in the grass howled, a sound like wind through broken windows. Amanda fell to her knees, clutching her head, and for just a moment her eyes cleared and I saw the real Amanda looking out, terrified and pleading. "Run!" she whispered before the thing wearing her face reasserted control. I ran. Behind me, the howling grew louder, more furious. I could hear them pursuing me through the grass, crashing through the stalks with inhuman speed. But the crucifix in my hand seemed to create a bubble of protection around me, a space they couldn't quite enter. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, collapsing beside the muddy creek where I'd first found Derek that morning. The water was barely ankle deep, but it was running water, and in my grandmother's stories, running water was a barrier that evil spirits couldn't cross. I waded into the creek and followed it north, away from the campsite, clutching the crucifix so tightly that its edges cut into my palm. Behind me, the howling continued, but it grew more distant with each step. I walked through the creek for hours, until the sun began to set and paint the sky the color of blood. Finally, I saw lights ahead, a farmhouse with warm yellow windows and the blessed sound of a dog barking. The family who lived there, the Kowalskis, found me half dead from dehydration and exposure, clutching a silver crucifix and babbling about wendigos and hunger that walked on two legs. They called the sheriff, who organized a search party for my missing friends. They found our campsite, but Marcus, Derek, and Amanda were never located. The official report blamed the prairie, easy to get lost in, dangerous for city folks who didn't understand the vastness or the sudden weather changes that could kill the unprepared. They found our car with its battery mysteriously drained. They found our scattered gear and the remains of several small animals that had been torn apart and partially eaten. They found footprints that didn't quite match any human foot, circling the campsite in patterns that made no sense. But they didn't find my friends. I never went back to the Flint Hills. I moved to Colorado, where the mountains provide clear boundaries and the valleys offer places to hide. I avoid wide-open spaces, and I never camp anywhere that isn't crowded with other people. But sometimes, late at night when the wind picks up and carries scents I can't identify, I remember Derek's smile and Amanda's pleading eyes. I remember the sound of things moving through tall grass, and I wonder if they're still out there, waiting for the next group of city folks who think they need to reconnect with nature. I wear my grandmother's crucifix every day now, and I keep iron nails in my pockets. Call it superstition if you want, but I've learned that some hungers are older than civilization, and they're always waiting in the empty places where people are foolish enough to think they're alone. The prairie remembers everything, and it's always hungry. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, certain I can hear footsteps circling my house and a voice like Derek's calling my name through the darkness. On those nights, I grip the crucifix until my knuckles turn white, and I pray to whatever gods might be listening that the hunger stays in Kansas. in the tall grass, where it belongs. But deep down, I know it's only a matter of time before it comes looking for the one that got away. My name is David Jones, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve in Kansas, where the endless sea of grass stretches beyond the horizon like a living ocean frozen in time. I should have listened to my instincts when Sarah first suggested the camping trip. My girlfriend of 2 years had been pushing for us to reconnect with nature after months of tension between us. Work stress, family problems, the usual relationship friction that builds like sediment in still water. The prairie seemed like neutral ground, vast, empty, peaceful. What could go wrong in a place where you could see for miles in every direction? We drove out from Topeka on a Friday afternoon in late September. My old Toyota loaded with camping gear and enough supplies for a long weekend. Sarah sat beside me, her auburn hair catching the late sunlight as she studied the map spread across her lap. She'd done her research, marking campsites near the historic limestone schoolhouse and the old ranch sites scattered throughout the preserve. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a small notation on the map. "There's supposed to be a stone circle near the Z-Bar Ranch, Native American ceremonial site. We should check it out." I kept my eyes on the road, watching the landscape gradually flatten into an endless expanse of tall grass that swayed hypnotically in the wind. Something about the uniformity of it made me uncomfortable. No trees to break the monotony, no hills to provide landmarks, just grass, grass, and more grass stretching to every horizon. "Maybe," I said, "let's just focus on setting up camp first." Sarah had been different lately, more secretive, staying out late with friends I'd never met, taking phone calls in the other room. Part of me hoped this trip would help us work through whatever was building between us. The other part wondered if she'd brought me out here to break up with me somewhere I couldn't easily leave. We arrived at the preserve as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The visitor center was closed, and we were the only car in the parking lot. Sarah had secured a backcountry camping permit for a site about 2 miles into the prairie, accessible only by hiking trail. I hefted my pack, heavy with our tent and sleeping bags, while Sarah carried the lighter load of food and water. The trail was little more than a mowed path through the tall grass, marked occasionally by small wooden posts. The grass rose above our heads on both sides, creating a natural corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. The silence was oppressive. No bird songs, no insect buzz, just the constant whisper of wind through the grass that sounded almost like voices. "It's so quiet," Sarah murmured after we'd been walking for 20 minutes. "I've never heard quiet like this." She was right. The silence had weight to it, pressing down on us like a thick blanket. Even our footsteps seemed muffled by the soft earth and dense vegetation. I found myself straining to hear something, anything, that would break the monotony of that endless whisper. We reached our designated campsite just as the sun touched the horizon. It was a small clearing surrounded by a ring of native cottonwood trees, with a fire ring made of prairie limestone and a wooden picnic table weathered gray by years of Kansas weather. Sarah immediately began unpacking while I surveyed our surroundings. The clearing felt wrong somehow. The grass around us had been cut back, but it pressed in on all sides like it was waiting for permission to reclaim the space. Beyond the ring of trees, the prairie stretched away in all directions, an ocean of movement under the dying light. "David, help me with this tent," Sarah called. I turned to find her struggling with our 2-person dome tent, the same one we'd used on a dozen camping trips over the years. But something was off. The fabric seemed older, more faded than I remembered. When I grabbed the other end, the material felt different too, rougher, almost brittle. "When did you last check this thing?" I asked. "Last month. It was fine." But her voice carried uncertainty. We managed to get the tent up as darkness fell across the prairie. I built a fire while Sarah prepared a simple dinner of canned chili and bread. The flames cast dancing shadows on the trees around us, but beyond that small circle of light, the darkness was absolute. No city glow, no distant farmhouse lights, nothing but an endless black void punctuated by the constant whisper of wind through grass. "Listen," Sarah said suddenly. I paused, spoon halfway to my mouth. The wind had stopped. The prairie had gone completely silent for the first time since our arrival. In that silence, I could hear something else. A low, humming sound, barely audible, like someone singing under their breath. "You hear that?" I whispered. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide in the firelight. "Where's it coming from?" The humming continued for perhaps 30 seconds, then faded back into the normal sounds of wind and grass. But the silence that followed felt different, heavier, like something was listening. "Probably just the wind through some rock formation," I said, trying to convince myself as much as Sarah. "You know how sound carries out here." We finished dinner in relative quiet, then sat by the fire sharing a bottle of wine Sarah had brought. The alcohol helped ease the tension, and we talked about safer subjects: work, her sister's upcoming wedding, plans for Thanksgiving. Normal couple conversations that felt increasingly precious in the alien landscape surrounding us. Around 10 o'clock, Sarah excused herself to use the portable bathroom we'd set up behind a screen of trees. I remained by the fire, feeding it branches from the deadfall we'd collected earlier. The flames had taken on an odd greenish tint that I attributed to the mineral content of the local wood. Sarah had been gone for nearly 15 minutes when I started to worry. "Sarah," I called. "You okay over there?" No response. The wind had picked up again, sending waves through the grass that looked like ripples across water in the firelight. I called her name again, louder this time. "Sarah?" Her voice came back to me from somewhere in the darkness beyond our camp, but it sounded strange, flat and emotionless. "I'm here." "Where? I can't see you." "I'm here." The same words in the same toneless voice. I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the sound, pushing through the screen of trees where we'd set up the makeshift bathroom. The portable toilet was there, unused. Sarah's footprints led away from it, deeper into the prairie. "Sarah, this isn't funny. Where are you?" "I'm here." Her voice came from a different direction now, maybe 50 yards to my left. Then, impossibly from directly behind me, "I'm here." My skin crawled. I spun around, sweeping the flashlight beam in a wide arc, but saw nothing except grass bending in the wind. The beam seemed weaker than it should be, barely penetrating 10 feet into the darkness. "Sarah, please, come back to camp." Silence. Then, from what sounded like directly above me, "I'm here." I ran back to the fire, my heart hammering. This had to be some kind of joke, though I couldn't imagine how she was pulling it off. Maybe she was trying to scare me, get back at me for something. But the Sarah I knew wasn't cruel, and she'd never been particularly good at pranks. I sat by the fire for another hour, calling her name periodically and getting no response. The flames continued to burn with that strange greenish cast, and I noticed that the shadows they threw seemed to move independently of the flickering light. Just after midnight, I heard footsteps approaching camp. I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. Sarah emerged from the darkness, walking slowly and deliberately. Her clothes were covered in grass stains and dirt, and there were scratches on her arms and face from pushing through the tall grass. But what disturbed me most was her expression, or lack thereof. Her face was completely blank, eyes focused on something beyond me. "Jesus, Sarah, where have you been? I've been calling for you for hours." She walked past me without acknowledgement and sat down at the picnic table. In the firelight, I could see that her pupils were dilated to pinpoints despite the darkness. "Sarah, are you hurt? Did you hit your head?" She turned to look at me then, and what I saw in her face made my blood turn to ice. It was Sarah's face, Sarah's body, but something else was looking out through her eyes. Something that didn't quite understand how to arrange human features into normal expressions. "I'm here," she said in that same flat voice I'd heard from the darkness. "Where did you go? I've been worried sick." She tilted her head to one side like a bird studying an insect. "I went to the circle. What circle? The stone circle, where they sing. A chill ran down my spine. The stone circle she'd mentioned from the map, the supposed Native American ceremonial site near the Z-Bar Ranch. But that was miles from here. Sarah, that's on the other side of the preserve. You couldn't have walked there and back in 3 hours. She smiled then, but it was wrong. Too wide, held too long, with too many teeth showing. Time moves differently in the circle. I wanted to reach for her, to shake her until she snapped out of whatever this was, but something held me back. Every instinct screamed that the thing sitting across from me wasn't entirely my girlfriend anymore. What happened at the circle, Sarah? They were waiting. They've been waiting so long. Her voice carried an odd resonance now, like an echo of an echo. They showed me things. Beautiful things. Things you can't understand. Who was waiting? The singers. The ones who came before. They never left. David. They're still here. In the grass, in the wind, in the stones. She leaned forward, and I caught a smell coming off her that hadn't been there before. Something earthy and rotten, like mushrooms growing in a grave. They want to meet you. I stood up slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements. Sarah, I think you might have hit your head or something. You're not making sense. Let me check you for injuries. I'm not injured. She stood as well, moving with an odd, disjointed gait like a marionette operated by an inexperienced puppeteer. I'm better now. They fixed the broken parts. What broken parts? The parts that hurt. The parts that were angry. The parts that didn't love you anymore. The words hit me like a physical blow. We'd been having problems, yes, but I hadn't realized she'd fallen out of love with me. Or maybe whatever was speaking through her was just saying things designed to hurt. Sarah, please. I don't know what's happened to you, but we need to get you to a hospital. She laughed, but the sound was wrong. Too many notes, like a chord played on an out-of-tune piano. Hospitals can't fix what I am now. Nothing can fix it. Nothing wants to fix it. She began walking toward me, and I backed away until I felt the heat of the fire against my legs. In the shifting light, her shadow seemed to move independently, stretching and contracting like it was alive. They want to fix you too, David. They want to take away all the parts that hurt. I don't want to be fixed. Everyone wants to be fixed. Everyone wants the pain to stop. She was close enough now that I could see her pupils weren't just dilated. They were completely black, reflecting the firelight like polished obsidian. It only hurts for a moment. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire and held it between us. Stay back, Sarah. I'm warning you. She paused, tilting her head again. Fire won't hurt me now. Nothing hurts me now. But she didn't come any closer. Instead, she turned and walked toward our tent. Where are you going? To sleep. We have a long walk tomorrow. What walk? To the circle. They're waiting for you. She unzipped the tent and crawled inside. I remained by the fire, branch in hand, listening to the sounds of her settling into her sleeping bag. After a few minutes, I heard steady breathing that suggested she was asleep. I didn't sleep that night. I fed the fire and tried to make sense of what had happened. Sarah had clearly had some kind of psychological break, maybe triggered by stress or something she'd eaten. People didn't just get possessed by prairie spirits. That was the stuff of campfire stories and horror movies. But as the night wore on, the rational explanations became harder to maintain. The fire continued to burn with that greenish cast, and the shadows it threw seemed to writhe and dance independently of the flames. Several times I heard that low humming again, coming from different directions, sometimes sounding like one voice, sometimes like many. Around 3 a.m, I heard Sarah talking in her sleep. At first, the words were too muffled to understand, but as I crept closer to the tent, they became clearer. Yes, she was saying. Yes, I understand. He'll come willingly if he thinks I want him to. He loves me. He'll follow me anywhere. My blood ran cold. I backed away from the tent and returned to the fire, but sleep was now impossible. Whatever had happened to Sarah, she was planning to lead me somewhere, probably to the stone circle she'd mentioned, and I had a terrible feeling that if I went there, I wouldn't be coming back. Dawn came slowly, painting the prairie grass gold and red in the early light. The vastness of the landscape was even more apparent in daylight. We were truly in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest road, with nothing but grass in every direction. I heard Sarah stirring in the tent and quickly busied myself with making coffee over the fire. She emerged looking normal. Tired, but normal, with no trace of the blank-eyed thing that had confronted me the night before. "Morning," she said, stretching and yawning. "Sleep well?" "Not really. You don't remember last night?" She frowned. "What about last night? We had dinner, talked by the fire, went to bed. Was there something else?" I studied her face carefully. She seemed genuinely confused, with none of the wrongness I'd sensed before. Either she was an exceptional actress or whatever had taken hold of her came and went. "You went for a walk, disappeared for hours." I was worried. "I did." She looked down at her clothes, noticing the grass stains and dirt for the first time. "I don't remember that at all. Maybe I was sleepwalking? I used to do that as a kid when I was stressed." It was possible. Stress could cause all sorts of behavioral changes, and she'd been under pressure at work lately. Maybe I'd let the isolation and strange atmosphere of the prairie play tricks on my mind. "Maybe," I said. "How do you feel now?" "Fine. Actually, better than fine. I feel great." She smiled, and this time it looked normal, warm and genuine. Like a weight's been lifted off my shoulders. We had breakfast and broke camp, packing our gear for the hike back to the car. I was eager to leave the prairie behind, but Sarah seemed reluctant. "I want to see that stone circle first," she said as we shouldered our packs. "Sarah, it's miles away, and after last night, please, David, I have this feeling that it's important, that we need to see it." The pleading in her voice sounded genuine, but I remembered her words from the night before. "He'll come willingly if he thinks I want him to." Was this part of whatever plan the thing inside her had made? "I really think we should head home. You had some kind of episode last night, and I'm worried about you." Her expression darkened for just a moment, a flash of something cold and alien, before the warm smile returned. "I'm fine now. Better than I've been in months. Trust me." Against my better judgment, I agreed. Maybe seeing this place in daylight would help me understand what had happened to her. And if she was having psychological problems, it might be better to let her work through them before we returned to civilization. The hike to the Zed Bar Ranch area took most of the morning. Sarah led the way with unerring accuracy, as if she'd walked the route dozens of times before. She moved through the tall grass with a strange grace, never stumbling or losing her footing despite the uneven terrain. "How do you know where you're going?" I asked after we'd been walking for over an hour. "I can feel it," she said without turning around. "Can't you? It's like a tuning fork in my chest." I couldn't feel anything except growing unease, but I followed her deeper into the prairie. The grass here was taller and denser, reaching well above our heads and creating a maze of green corridors. The sun beat down mercilessly, and I found myself constantly checking my compass to maintain our bearings. We crested a low rise, and Sarah stopped suddenly. "There," she said, pointing down into a shallow valley. The stone circle was smaller than I'd expected. Maybe 20 feet in diameter, composed of rough limestone blocks arranged in a perfect ring. The grass had been cleared from the interior, revealing bare earth that looked recently disturbed. At the center stood a single stone pillar, carved with symbols I didn't recognize. But what made my skin crawl was that we weren't alone. 7 figures stood motionless around the circle's perimeter, their backs to us. They wore modern clothes, jeans, t-shirts, hiking boots, but something about their posture was wrong. They stood too still, too perfectly aligned like mannequins positioned by an obsessive window dresser. "Sarah," I whispered, grabbing her arm, "we need to leave, now." She shrugged off my grip with surprising strength. "Don't be afraid. They're friends." "Those aren't friends. Those aren't even—" But she was already walking down the slope toward the circle. I had no choice but to follow, though every instinct screamed at me to run. As we approached, one of the figures turned to face us. It had been a man once, middle-aged, wearing a University of Kansas t-shirt and khaki shorts. But his eyes were the same black pools I'd seen in Sarah's face the night before, and his skin had a waxy, unnatural sheen. "Welcome," he said in a voice like wind through dry leaves. "We've been waiting." The other figures turned in unison, revealing faces I recognized from missing person reports I'd seen over the years. Hikers, campers, hunters who'd vanished in the Kansas wilderness and never been found. They all wore the same empty expression, the same obsidian eyes. "Sarah, please," I said, backing away. "We have to go." But Sarah had already entered the circle. As soon as her feet crossed the stone boundary, she went rigid, her head snapping back as if she'd been electrocuted. When she looked at me again, the alien presence was back in full force. "Join us, David," she said, but her voice was joined by 6 others in perfect harmony. "Let us fix the broken parts." The figures began moving toward me in perfect synchronization, their movements jerky and unnatural. I turned and ran, crashing through the tall grass with no thought for direction or obstacles. Behind me, I could hear them following, not running, but walking with implacable purpose. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, finally collapsing in a patch of grass that looked identical to every other patch I'd seen. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, and I realized with growing horror that I was completely lost. As the sun began to set, I heard them coming. Not just the 7 from the circle, but more, dozens of voices humming in harmony, getting closer with each passing minute. I could see them now in the distance, dark figures moving through the grass like sharks through water. I found a small depression and huddled there as darkness fell, trying to make myself invisible. The humming grew louder, coming from all sides now, and I realized they had me surrounded. "David," Sarah's voice called from the darkness, "don't make this harder than it has to be. Come to us willingly, and it won't hurt." "We can take away the loneliness," said another voice, the man in the KU shirt. "The fear, the doubt, all the things that make you human." More voices joined the chorus, all the missing people who had found their way to the stone circle over the years, all offering the same thing: an end to pain, to uncertainty, to the burden of independent thought. "You can't hide forever," Sarah said, and her voice was much closer now. "We know where you are. We can smell your fear." I closed my eyes and tried to think. The stone circle was clearly some kind of focal point for whatever force had taken control of these people. Native American ceremonial site, Sarah had said. But maybe it was something older, something that had been drawing people to it for centuries. The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by complete silence. I opened my eyes and saw them arranged in a perfect circle around my hiding spot, their black eyes reflecting the starlight like points of obsidian. Sarah stepped forward, moving with that same unnatural grace. "It's time, David. Time to join us. Time to become something better." "What are you?" I whispered. "We are the harmony beneath the discord, the silence beneath the noise. We are what humans become when they stop fighting their true nature." She knelt beside me, and I could smell that earthy, rotten scent coming off her in waves. "The prairie remembers everything, David. Every footstep, every breath, every drop of blood that's ever fallen on this soil. The people who came before, they understood. They built the circle to contain us, to keep us focused in one place. But containment is not elimination." Her hand touched my face and it was cold as winter stone. We waited so long for the barriers to weaken, so long for someone to come who could help us spread beyond the circle. Sarah was perfect. So much pain, so much anger, so ready to be something else. "Let her go," I said, though I knew it was useless. "She doesn't want to be let go. She's happier now. They all are. No more suffering, no more doubt, no more choice. Just harmony. The others began to move closer, their humming resuming at a frequency I felt in my bones. I scrambled to my feet and broke through their circle, running blindly into the darkness. I don't know how far I ran or in what direction. The prairie had become a maze where every path led back to the stone circle. Every direction was the wrong direction. Time seemed to stretch and compress, and I began to suspect that Sarah had been right. Time did move differently here. When I finally collapsed from exhaustion, I found myself back in our original campsite. The fire ring was there, the picnic table, even the stakes where our tent had been. But something was wrong with the scale. Everything seemed smaller, more distant, like I was looking at it through the wrong end of a telescope. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call for help, but the screen was black and wouldn't respond to any button. When I tried my GPS device, the display showed nothing but static. As dawn broke over the prairie, I heard footsteps approaching. Sarah emerged from the tall grass looking perfectly normal except for those terrible black eyes. "You can't leave, David," she said gently. "The circle won't let you. It's been drawing you back all night. This is impossible. People don't just get possessed by whatever you are. People get possessed by all sorts of things. Love, hate, fear, ambition. We're just more honest about it." She sat down at the picnic table, gesturing for me to join her. The people who built the circle understood that humanity's greatest enemy is itself. All that chaos, all that individuality, it's a disease. We're the cure. By turning people into zombies. By turning them into something better. Something unified. Part of a greater whole. Her expression softened, and for a moment she looked like the Sarah I'd fallen in love with. "It doesn't hurt, David, and once you join us, you'll understand why this is necessary." I stood up, backing away from her. "No. Whatever you are, whatever you want, the answer is no." She sighed, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of centuries. "Then you'll keep running, keep fighting, keep suffering, but you can't leave the circle's influence now. You'll run in circles forever, getting more desperate, more frightened, until you finally understand that surrender is the only peace you'll ever find." As if to prove her point, I heard the humming again, coming from every direction at once. The other possessed figures emerged from the grass, forming a loose perimeter around the campsite. "Choose quickly, David," Sarah said, "while you still can choose." I looked at her face, at the thing wearing my girlfriend's face, and made my decision. I grabbed a sharp stone from the fire ring and slashed it across my palm, letting the blood drip onto the ground. "Blood calls to blood," I said, repeating something I'd heard in a documentary about Native American rituals. "Spirit calls to spirit. I offer my pain to the old guardians, the ones who built the circle to contain you." The humming stopped. Sarah's eyes widened, and for just a moment they flickered back to their normal brown. "David?" she whispered, and it was really her voice this time. "What's happening to me?" But the moment passed. The black returned to her eyes, and she snarled like an animal. "Clever. But the old guardians are long dead, and their power fades more each year. You've bought yourself time, nothing more." The circle of possessed figures began to tighten around me, but they moved more slowly now, as if fighting against some invisible resistance. I used the opportunity to run again, this time with a destination in mind: the visitor center. If I could reach the visitor center, I might find help, or at least a phone that worked. The run back through the prairie was a nightmare of déjà vu. Every landmark looked familiar, every turn seemed to lead me back toward the stone circle. But I kept moving, kept fighting the subtle force that tried to turn my steps in the wrong direction. The sun was high overhead when I finally saw the visitor center in the distance, its modern architecture looking alien after days in the prehistoric landscape of the prairie. I stumbled through the parking lot, expecting to find it locked, but the door opened at my touch. Inside, the center was empty but functional. The phones worked, the computers were on, and there was even fresh coffee in the break room, as if the staff had just stepped out for a moment. I called 911, but the dispatcher's voice was strange, too calm, too knowing. "What's the nature of your emergency?" she asked. "I need help. My girlfriend, she's been taken by something in the prairie. There are people out there, missing people. Sir, I need you to calm down. Can you tell me your location?" "The Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve, near the stone circle by the Z-Bar Ranch." A long pause. "Sir, there is no stone circle at that location. Are you certain of your whereabouts?" I looked at the map on the wall, searching for the circle that Sarah had marked days earlier. It wasn't there. According to the official map, there was nothing but empty prairie where I'd seen the limestone ring and its collection of possessed guardians. "It's there," I insisted. "Check your missing persons reports. All those hikers and campers who've disappeared over the years, they're all there, at the circle." "Sir, I'm going to transfer you to someone who can help." The line went dead. I tried calling back but got only a busy signal. When I tried other numbers, friends, family, even the operator, the result was the same. I was alone. That's when I noticed the guest book on the information desk. I flipped through the pages, looking for recent entries, and found something that made my blood freeze. The last entry was dated 3 months ago. It was written in Sarah's handwriting. "David and I had a wonderful time at the preserve. So peaceful, so quiet. We can't wait to come back." Below that, in my own handwriting, "This place changes you, makes you see things differently. We'll definitely be returning soon." I had no memory of writing those words, but the handwriting was unmistakably mine. I stumbled outside, desperate for fresh air and sanity. The parking lot was empty except for my Toyota, sitting exactly where I'd left it days earlier. But when I tried the doors, they were locked and my keys were missing. As the sun began to set, I heard them coming across the prairie, the humming, the whispered voices, the synchronized footsteps of the possessed. They emerged from the tall grass like a wave, dozens of them now, all moving with that same unnatural grace. Sarah led them, but she wasn't alone at the front of the group. Walking beside her was another figure I recognized with growing horror. Myself, or something wearing my face, my clothes, moving with my mannerisms but lacking something essential. "Hello, David," my double said as they approached. "Ready to come home?" I backed against the visitor center wall, trapped between the building and the advancing crowd. "You're not real," I said. "None of this is real." "Reality is subjective," Sarah replied. "The circle showed us that. Showed us how to be free of linear time, individual consciousness, all the limitations that make humans so small. The David you were is gone," my double continued. "Has been gone since the moment you entered the circle's influence. What you're experiencing now are just the death throes of an outdated consciousness. Let go. Join us. Become what you were always meant to be." The crowd pressed closer, and I could see that they weren't all strangers anymore. Mixed in with the missing hikers and campers were people I recognized. Co-workers, neighbors, even my own sister. All wearing the same empty expression, all humming in perfect harmony. "Time to choose, David," Sarah said, extending her hand toward me. "Time to stop running from yourself." I looked at her face, at the thing wearing her face, and realized with crystalline clarity that I'd been fighting the wrong battle. The real Sarah was gone, had been gone since that first night. What stood before me was just an echo, a memory given form by whatever ancient force inhabited the stone circle. But I was still here, still fighting, still choosing. I grabbed a loose brick from the visitor center's facade and brought it down on my double skull with all the strength I had left. The thing wearing my face staggered backward, black liquid pouring from the wound instead of blood. "Wrong choice," it said, grinning even as it collapsed. The crowd surged forward, but I was already moving. I vaulted over the fallen figure and ran into the prairie one last time, not away from the stone circle but toward it. If the circle was the source of their power, maybe it was also their weakness. The run through the darkening grassland was surreal. The possessed figures followed but didn't catch up, as if they knew where I was going and were content to let me reach my destination. The humming grew louder as I approached the valley, joined now by other sounds. Chanting in languages I didn't recognize, the scrape of stone on stone, the whisper of wind through empty bones. The circle blazed with unnatural light when I crested the rise. The limestone blocks had somehow multiplied, forming concentric rings that spiraled inward toward the central pillar. And around those rings danced hundreds of figures, not just the recently possessed, but older ones too, wearing clothes from different eras, different centuries. At the very center, Sarah waited for me. "Welcome home, David," she said as I stumbled down the slope. "Welcome to forever." I entered the circle, and immediately felt the weight of centuries pressing down on my consciousness. The stone pillar pulsed with dark energy, covered now in carvings that seemed to move and writhe in the unnatural light. But I hadn't come here to surrender. I pulled out my phone, dead for days, and was amazed to see it flicker to life. The screen showed dozens of missed calls, text messages, voicemails from people wondering where I was. The outside world still existed, still remembered me. "Impossible," Sarah hissed. "The circle controls all electronic devices within its influence." "Maybe it doesn't control everything," I said, and began typing a text message to every contact in my phone. "Tallgrass Prairie, Stone Circle, send help. Don't let anyone else come here alone." I hit send just as Sarah lunged for the phone. We struggled over it, but I managed to hurl it against the central pillar, where it shattered in a shower of sparks and plastic. The reaction was immediate. The possessed figures surrounding the circle stopped their dance and turned toward us, their humming rising to a painful pitch. The stones began to crack, and that unnatural light flickered like a candle in a hurricane. "What have you done?" Sarah screamed, but her voice was fracturing, becoming multiple voices, becoming none. "I've broken the harmony," I said, "connected you to the outside world. You can't maintain your isolation if people know where to find you." The central pillar began to topple, its ancient carvings crumbling to dust. As it fell, the possessed figures started to collapse as well, their borrowed consciousness finally released. Sarah reached for me one last time, her face cycling between the woman I'd loved and the alien thing that had taken her place. "David," she whispered, and her voice was her own again. "I'm sorry. I couldn't fight it." Then she was gone, crumbling to dust along with all the others, leaving only empty clothes scattered around the broken circle. I stood alone in the prairie darkness, surrounded by the debris of something that had existed for far longer than human civilization. In the distance, I could see lights, real lights, moving across the landscape. Search teams responding to my final message. By the time they found me, the stone circle had vanished completely, leaving only a patch of disturbed earth and the lingering scent of something ancient and rotten. I told them everything, but they found no evidence to support my story. No missing persons, no strange disappearances, no reports of anything unusual in the Tallgrass Prairie. According to official records, Sarah had never existed. But I remember her. I remember all of them. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind blows just right, I can still hear them humming, not from the prairie, but from somewhere much closer, from the walls of my apartment, from the space between my heartbeats, from the darkness behind my eyes when I try to sleep. The doctors say I suffered a psychotic break triggered by stress and isolation. They have reasonable explanations for everything. Hallucinations brought on by dehydration, false memories created by trauma, the classic symptoms of a man who spent too long alone in an unfamiliar environment. They prescribed medication and therapy, and slowly I learned to function in the world again. But I know what I experienced was real. The evidence is subtle but persistent. My phone's GPS history shows I was in areas of the preserve that don't officially exist. My credit card was charged for camping permits I never applied for, and sometimes when I'm not paying attention, I catch myself humming that low, harmonious tune that still echoes in my memory. 3 months after my rescue, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph of the tallgrass prairie, taken from an impossible angle, as if the camera had been floating high above the grassland. At the center of the image was a dark stain on the earth, roughly circular where nothing would grow. On the back of the photograph, in Sarah's handwriting, were 4 words. "The circle remembers everything." I burned the photograph, but it didn't matter. I could still see it clearly in my mind, could still feel the pull of that empty space in the prairie. The rational part of me knew I should stay away, should never return to Kansas, should forget everything that had happened there. But the other part, the part that had been touched by whatever lived in that stone circle, whispered different advice. It told me that the experience had been incomplete, that I had been chosen for something greater than mere escape. It reminded me how peaceful Sarah had looked in those final moments before she crumbled to dust, how free she had seemed from all the pain and uncertainty that plagued human existence. 6 months later, I quit my job and sold my apartment. I told my friends and family I was taking a sabbatical, maybe doing some traveling, finding myself. They worried, but they also understood. Everyone knew I'd been through something traumatic, something that had changed me in ways both visible and hidden. I drove west in a new car, following back roads and forgotten highways toward Kansas. The closer I got to the tallgrass prairie, the stronger the humming became in my head. By the time I crossed the state line, it was so loud I could barely think about anything else. The visitor center was closed when I arrived, but that didn't matter. I knew exactly where I was going. The hike through the tall grass felt like coming home. Every step took me deeper into a landscape that existed outside normal time and space, where the laws of physics bent to accommodate older, stranger realities. The grass whispered my name as I passed, and the wind carried voices I recognized. I found the circle just as the sun touched the western horizon. It had rebuilt itself, the limestone blocks arranged in the same pattern I remembered, the central pillar standing tall and unmarked. But this time, I wasn't afraid. Sarah was waiting for me at the circle's edge, exactly as I'd known she would be. She looked the way she had on our first date, young and beautiful and full of possibilities. Her eyes were brown again, warm and loving and entirely human. "I knew you'd come back," she said, taking my hand. "I knew you'd understand eventually." "I missed you," I said, and meant it. I missed all of you. The others emerged from the grass around us, all the people who had found their way to this place over the years, all the souls who had chosen harmony over chaos, unity over individuality. They welcomed me with smiles and songs, with the promise of an end to loneliness and doubt. I stepped into the circle willingly this time, and felt the weight of human consciousness lift from my shoulders like a discarded coat. The transformation was gentle, almost loving, a gradual dissolution of everything that had made me separate and afraid. As my individual self faded into the greater harmony, I had one last thought that was entirely my own. This story would never be found, never be read, never serve as a warning to others who might be drawn to the tall grass prairie, because I was writing it only in my memory, and soon even that would belong to the circle. But perhaps that was for the best. Some truths are too dangerous to share, too tempting to resist. Better to let people discover the circle on their own, in their own time, when they're ready to become something more than merely human. The humming grows louder now, calling to those who are lost and searching, those who are tired of carrying the burden of independent thought. It spreads through the wind and grass, through the fiber optic cables and radio waves that connect our modern world, waiting patiently for the next visitor to our peaceful prairie home. Listen carefully, and you might hear it too, that beautiful harmony that lies just beneath the chaos of everyday life. Follow it west, follow it home, Follow it to the place where all pain ends and perfect unity begins. We'll be waiting for you in the tall grass, singing our eternal song. After all, there's always room for one more in the circle. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve, about 15 miles southeast of Strong City, Kansas, in a section of wilderness that most tourists never see. I'd been planning this solo backpacking trip for months, needing to escape the suffocating routine of my accounting job in Topeka. The divorce papers had been finalized 3 weeks earlier, and Marcus had taken everything that mattered, including our golden retriever, Benny, who now lived with him and his 20-something secretary in their new house. The therapist said I needed to reconnect with myself, whatever that meant. So I'd loaded my Honda Civic with camping gear and driven south toward the Flint Hills, where endless waves of prairie grass stretched toward horizons that seemed to breathe. The preserve covers nearly 11,000 acres of native tallgrass prairie, one of the last remnants of an ecosystem that once covered 170 million acres of North America. I'd done my research, studied the maps, even called the visitor center to ask about the more remote trails. The ranger, a weathered woman named Carol, had recommended the Fox Creek Trail extension that led deep into the backcountry, away from the day hikers and RV campers. "It's beautiful out there," she'd said, "but make sure you stay on the marked paths. The grass can get thick enough to hide ravines, and cell service is spotty at best." I should have listened more carefully to that warning. The October afternoon was unseasonably warm when I shouldered my pack and started down the limestone gravel trail. The big bluestem and Indian grass rose above my head in places, creating natural corridors that swayed hypnotically in the constant wind. Prairie sunflowers dotted the landscape like scattered coins, and red-winged blackbirds called from hidden perches. For the first time in months, I felt something approaching peace. The main trail was well-maintained, marked with occasional wooden posts bearing the Kansas Prairie logo. But after about 2 miles, I spotted a fainter path branching southeast, barely visible through the grass. My map showed it as a dotted line labeled Primitive Trail, experienced hikers only. The perfectionist in me wanted to stick to the planned route, but something about that hidden path called to me. Maybe it was the rebellious streak I'd been suppressing for 15 years of marriage to a man who color-coded his sock drawer. I turned off the main trail. The primitive path was immediately different. The grass pressed closer, sometimes brushing my shoulders as I walked. The wind seemed muffled here, creating an odd acoustic bubble where my footsteps and breathing sounded unnaturally loud. After about a mile, I came to a small wooden sign, weathered almost to illegibility. Fox Creek Wilderness Area. No maintained trails beyond this point. Perfect. This was exactly the kind of solitude I needed. The path continued for another half-mile before simply ending. Not gradually petering out, but stopping abruptly at the edge of a shallow depression filled with even taller grass. My GPS showed I was roughly 3 miles from the nearest road, deep in a section of the preserve that wasn't covered by the detailed trail maps. The sun was still high, maybe 3 hours until sunset, so I decided to push on toward a low ridge visible to the east where I could set up camp with a good view of the surrounding prairie. That's when I first noticed the smell. It was subtle at first, almost masked by the green scent of prairie grass and the earthiness of limestone soil. But as I climbed toward the ridge, it grew stronger. A sickly sweet odor that reminded me of the time a mouse had died inside the walls of our house, and we'd spent days trying to locate the source. I'd hoped never to smell that particular combination of decay and putrefaction again. The ridge wasn't as elevated as it had appeared from a distance. When I reached the top, panting slightly from the climb through thick grass, I found myself on a relatively flat area maybe 50 yards across, scattered with chunks of limestone and a few stunted oak trees. The view was spectacular, rolling hills of grass extending to the horizon in every direction, painted gold and green by the afternoon sun. But the smell was stronger here, emanating from somewhere downwind. I set up my tent between two of the oak trees, their sparse canopy providing minimal shade but at least some visual anchor in the sea of grass. As I worked, I kept catching whiffs of that decay smell, carried on the constant prairie wind. Probably a deer or coyote that had died somewhere nearby. The natural cycle of life and death, nothing more. By the time I had camp established, the sun was touching the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been breathtaking under other circumstances. But something felt wrong. The smell was getting worse, and I'd begun to notice other things that didn't quite fit, like the complete absence of insects. I hadn't seen a single grasshopper, cricket, or beetle since leaving the main trail, and the bird calls that had been constant background noise earlier in the day had gradually faded to silence. I tried to convince myself it was normal. Different ecosystems, different wildlife patterns. But as darkness began to settle over the prairie, the silence felt oppressive. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. I'd brought a small camp stove and heated up a packet of beef stew, though my appetite had largely disappeared. The smell was making me nauseous, and I found myself breathing through my mouth to avoid it. As I ate, I studied my map by headlamp, trying to figure out exactly where I was. The GPS coordinates put me roughly in the center of a large, unmarked area, but the map showed several seasonal creeks that might explain the depression I'd crossed earlier. After dinner, I tried to start a fire using dead wood from the oak trees. The wood was dry and should have caught easily, but the flames kept sputtering and dying. Each time I managed to get a small blaze going, it would flicker between normal orange and an odd greenish color before guttering out. After the fourth attempt, I gave up and relied on my headlamp. That's when I heard the first sound. It came from somewhere down the slope, in the direction of the smell. A wet, sliding noise, like something heavy being dragged through mud. But there was no mud here. The limestone soil was dry and rocky. I turned off my headlamp and listened intently, but the sound didn't repeat. Just the endless whisper of wind through grass. I told myself it was an animal. A raccoon, foraging maybe, or a possum. But possums don't make sliding sounds, and raccoons are much smaller. I turned the headlamp back on and swept it across the surrounding grass, seeing nothing but stems and shadows swaying in the breeze. The smell was definitely getting worse. I retreated to my tent around 9 o'clock, though I had no intention of sleeping yet. The nylon walls felt inadequate against whatever was out there, but at least they provided the illusion of shelter. I lay in my sleeping bag with a paperback novel, trying to lose myself in someone else's story, but the words kept blurring together. Every few minutes, I found myself listening for that sliding sound. It came again around 10:30, longer this time and definitely closer. A rhythmic scraping, like something being pulled across rough ground. I unzipped the tent flap just enough to peer out, but my headlamp beam revealed nothing except grass moving in the wind. The movement looked wrong somehow, too synchronized, as if the entire prairie was breathing in unison. I was starting to understand why the trail maps labeled this area as primitive. It wasn't just the lack of maintained paths. There was something fundamentally different about this place, something that made my skin crawl and my pulse quicken. The isolation I'd sought suddenly felt less like freedom and more like imprisonment. Around midnight, I finally dozed off with the headlamp still clutched in my hand. I woke to the sound of footsteps. Not animal footsteps, human footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my tent. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, as someone or something walked around my campsite. The steps were odd, uneven, with occasional pauses that lasted too long, as if whoever it was kept stopping to examine something, or to listen. The footsteps completed one full circle, then another. On the third circuit, they stopped directly outside the tent entrance. I could hear breathing, deep, labored breaths that sounded wrong somehow. Too wet, too rattling like someone with fluid in their lungs. "Hello," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. The breathing stopped. I waited for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then, very slowly, something began to scratch at the tent fabric near where my head lay. Long, deliberate scrapes, like fingernails drawing lines in the nylon. The sound made my teeth ache. "Who's there?" I said. Louder this time. The scratching stopped. The breathing resumed, so close I could feel the tent wall moving slightly with each exhalation. Then, in a voice that sounded like gravel being poured through a sieve, something spoke. "Jennifer." My blood turned to ice water. Nobody knew where I was. I hadn't told anyone my specific plans, hadn't left an itinerary with the rangers. How did this thing know my name? "Jennifer," it said again, the voice seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "Come out, Jennifer. Come see what I've found." I grabbed my phone, hands shaking so badly I could barely operate the touchscreen. No signal. Of course. The GPS function still worked, showing my location as a tiny dot surrounded by green emptiness, but the mapping data was useless out here. The voice came again, closer now, almost directly against the tent wall by my ear. "I know you're awake, Jennifer. I can smell your fear. Come out and play." The breathing was getting louder, more labored, and underneath it I could hear that wet sliding sound again, as if whatever was out there wasn't entirely solid. I slowly reached for the camping knife I kept in the outer pocket of my pack. It wasn't much, just a 3-inch folding blade, but it was better than nothing. The metal felt cold and inadequate in my sweating palm. "Jennifer, Jennifer, Jennifer," the voice chanted, circling the tent again. With each repetition it sounded less human, more like wind through a broken reed. "Pretty Jennifer, lost Jennifer, alone Jennifer." That's when I realized the smell from earlier hadn't been a dead animal at all. It was coming from whatever was outside my tent, the sickly sweet stench of advanced decay, so strong now that it was making my eyes water. I had to get out of there. Moving as quietly as possible, I stuffed my sleeping bag and gathered my essentials: phone, knife, headlamp, water bottles. The plan was simple: wait for the thing to move away from the tent entrance, then make a run for it. I knew the general direction back to the main trail. If I could just reach the marked paths, maybe I could find help. The chanting stopped. The breathing faded. After several minutes of silence, I carefully unzipped the tent flap and peered out. The campsite was empty. My headlamp beam swept across the oak trees, the scattered limestone, the walls of prairie grass. Nothing moved except the eternal wind. But the smell lingered, so thick I could taste it. I slipped out of the tent and shouldered my pack, moving as quietly as possible toward what I hoped was the western edge of the ridge. Behind me, something made a sound like wet cloth being torn, but I didn't look back. I plunged into the tall grass, using my headlamp to navigate by compass bearing. The grass was thicker at night, seeming to grab at my clothes and pack straps. Several times I stumbled into hidden depressions or tripped over chunks of limestone, but I pressed on, driven by the certainty that staying at the campsite meant something far worse than a twisted ankle. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, I stopped to check my GPS. I'd traveled roughly half a mile west, which should have put me close to the area where I'd left the primitive trail. But when I looked around, nothing seemed familiar. The grass stretched endlessly in every direction, uniform and disorienting. That's when I heard the voice again. "Jennifer, where are you going?" It came from directly behind me, close enough that I should have been able to see whatever was speaking. I spun around, knife ready, but found only empty grass swaying in the wind. "You can't leave yet. Jennifer, we haven't finished playing." The voice was coming from everywhere and nowhere, echoing strangely in the acoustic maze of prairie grass. I started walking faster, then jogging, then running blind through the stems and shadows. Behind me, that wet, sliding sound kept pace, sometimes seeming to come from my left, sometimes from my right, sometimes from directly overhead. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs trembled, then stopped to catch my breath and check my bearings. The GPS showed I'd been moving in rough circles, never getting more than a few hundred yards from my starting point. It was as if the prairie itself was conspiring to keep me trapped. "Lost, Jennifer?" The voice was different now, multiple voices speaking in unison, some high and some low, some male and some female. Poor little Jennifer, all alone in the dark. I closed my eyes and tried to think rationally. Panic was making me disoriented, causing me to make poor decisions. I needed to pick a direction and stick with it, regardless of what my GPS said. The primitive trail had to be somewhere to the west, and beyond that was the main trail and eventually the parking area. But when I opened my eyes, I wasn't alone anymore. They stood in a rough circle around me, maybe 20 feet away, just at the edge of my headlamp beam. At first glance, they looked human. Men, women, and children of various ages, all wearing clothes that seemed wrong somehow, faded and tattered as if they'd been wearing them for a very long time. But as my light played across their faces, I saw that human was only an approximation. Their skin had a waxy, translucent quality, like old candles left in the sun. Their eyes reflected light like an animal's, but the wrong color, not the green or yellow of nocturnal mammals, but a pale, milky blue. And they were all smiling, the same too wide smile that showed too many teeth. "Hello, Jennifer," they said in unison, their voices creating that awful chorus I'd heard before. "We've been waiting for you." The closest one, a woman in a dress that might once have been floral print, took a step forward. As she moved, I could see that her feet weren't quite touching the ground. None of them were. They hovered just inches above the prairie grass, swaying slightly like kelp in an underwater current. "Waiting for you to join us," continued the chorus, "waiting for you to stay." I raised the knife, though I knew it would be useless against whatever these things were. "Stay back," I said, surprised that my voice worked at all. "I'm warning you." They laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with wind chimes. The laughter went on too long, building in intensity until it became a shriek that made my ears pop. "Silly Jennifer," they said when the laughter finally died. "You can't hurt us. We're already dead." The woman in the floral dress was close enough now that I could see the details of her decay. Her face was partially caved in on one side, showing blackened bone beneath papery skin. Her dress was stained with something dark that had once been blood. But she kept smiling that horrible smile, head tilted at an angle that would have been impossible for a living person. "We died here, Jennifer. Died and couldn't leave. The prairie keeps us, feeds us, makes us strong." She gestured to the others. "We were like you once, lost, alone, frightened. But now we're family," added a man whose throat had been torn open, the wound gaping like a second mouth. "And we want you to be family too." I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. They formed a complete circle now, floating shapes in tattered clothes, all wearing that same impossible smile. Some were missing limbs, others had wounds that should have been fatal, and one small child appeared to have been burned beyond recognition. But they all moved with the same eerie grace, hovering just above the grass. "How did you die?" I asked, stalling for time while I tried to think of a way out. "Different ways," said the woman in the floral dress. "I was hiking alone, like you. Got turned around in the grass, walked in circles for days before I finally collapsed. Harold there," she nodded toward the man with the torn throat, "was hunting illegally when something in the grass took him. Little Susie got separated from her family during a camping trip 30 years ago." The burned child waved at me with fingers that were mostly bone. "But the how doesn't matter," continued the woman. "What matters is that we're together now, forever, and you're going to join us." "I don't want to die," I said, hating how small my voice sounded. "Of course you do," they chorused. "That's why you came here. That's why you left the safe trail and walked into our home. You wanted to disappear, to escape, to stop being Jennifer Williams, divorced accountant from Topeka who couldn't even keep her husband happy. Their words hit like physical blows. How did they know about Marcus? About the divorce, the loneliness, the crushing sense of failure that had driven me to seek solitude in the first place. "We know because the prairie knows," said the woman reading my thoughts. "It feeds on sadness, on despair, on people who are already halfway gone. You didn't come here to find yourself, Jennifer. You came here to lose yourself. We're just helping you finish what you started." The circle began to close. I could feel the cold emanating from their bodies, smell the sweet stench of decay that clung to them like perfume. The knife felt pathetic in my hand, but I held it ready anyway. "Please," I said, "I changed my mind. I want to live." "Too late," they said. "You're already ours." That's when I noticed that my feet were no longer touching the ground. I looked down in horror to see prairie grass swaying several inches below my boots. I was floating, just like them, held suspended by some force I couldn't understand or fight. The knife fell from nerveless fingers and disappeared into the grass below. "Welcome home, Jennifer," said the woman in the floral dress, reaching out with hands that felt like ice and electricity. "Welcome to the family." But as her fingers touched mine, something unexpected happened. Instead of the killing cold I'd anticipated, I felt warmth. Not the healthy warmth of living skin, but the feverish heat of infection, of sickness, of something fundamentally wrong trying to grow inside me. And with that warmth came knowledge. I saw the truth of this place, the secret the tallgrass prairie had been keeping for generations. It wasn't just an ecosystem, it was a living thing, an entity that had learned to use the native grasses as its sensory organs and the limestone bedrock as its bones. It fed on loneliness, on despair, on people who came seeking solitude and found only death. But it needed vessels to collect its prey. The floating figures around me weren't ghosts or spirits, they were extensions of the prairie itself, animated puppets created from the bodies of previous victims. And now it wanted to add me to its collection. I felt my own will beginning to slip away, replaced by alien hunger that wasn't mine. The thing that lived in the grass was trying to hollow me out, to make me into another smiling puppet who would lure future victims into its trap. But I wasn't ready to give up. The warmth spreading through my body was like an infection, but infections could be fought. I focused on everything that made me Jennifer Williams. My memories, my fears, my petty resentments, even my recent failures. I clung to my identity like a drowning person clings to driftwood. "Fight it, Jennifer," I whispered to myself. "Don't let it win." The woman in the floral dress frowned, her impossible smile flickering for the first time. "Stop fighting," she said, but her voice sounded uncertain. "It's easier if you don't fight." I thought about Marcus, about the way he'd looked at me during our last argument. Disappointed, fed up, ready to move on to someone younger and more exciting. The memory hurt, but it was mine. My pain, my failure, my life. "No," I said aloud, "I'm not ready to die." The circle of figures began to waver like a mirage. Their smiles became forced, strained, showing the effort it took to maintain their human facades. I could see through them now, see the grass stalks that formed their crude skeletons, the limestone dust that gave them false substance. "You have to stay," they pleaded, their voices becoming thin and reedy. "The prairie needs you. We need you." But I was already falling, dropping back toward the earth as whatever force had been holding me aloft began to weaken. I hit the ground hard, driving the breath from my lungs, but I was touching solid earth again. Real earth, not the floating dreamscape of the prairie entity. The figures were fading, becoming translucent, their borrowed forms dissolving back into grass and shadow. Only the woman in the floral dress remained solid, and she was changing, her human mask slipping to reveal something made of twisted stems and rotting leaves. "You can't leave," she hissed, her voice now the sound of wind through dead vegetation. "No one leaves. The prairie won't let you." But even as she spoke, I could feel her power weakening. Dawn was coming. The eastern horizon was beginning to show the faintest hint of gray, and with it came a loosening of the supernatural grip that had held me captive. I stumbled to my feet and ran. This time, I didn't try to navigate by compass or GPS. I simply ran toward the growing light, crashing through the prairie grass like a woman possessed. Behind me, I could hear the entity's final desperate attempts to call me back. Whispers in the wind, voices of loved ones pleading for me to return, promises of peace and rest and an end to all struggle. But I kept running. The sun crested the horizon just as I stumbled onto the main trail, its light burning away the last vestiges of the prairie's influence. I collapsed onto the familiar gravel path, sobbing with relief and exhaustion. It took me another hour to reach the visitor center, where I found Carol, the ranger who'd recommended the Fox Creek Trail extension, opening up for the day. She took one look at my condition, scratched, disheveled, babbling about floating corpses and predatory grassland, and immediately called for medical assistance. Dehydration, the EMT said after checking my vitals. Maybe some mild hypothermia. Hallucinations are common when people get turned around out there, especially if they're not used to the isolation. I didn't argue. How could I explain what I'd really experienced? Who would believe that an entire ecosystem could be malevolent? That the beautiful tallgrass prairie was actually a trap designed to lure in the lonely and desperate? But I knew the truth. As they loaded me into the ambulance, I looked back toward the preserve and saw the grass swaying in the morning breeze. It looked peaceful, innocent, like nothing more than a remnant of America's natural heritage. I knew better. The nightmares started a week later. Every night, I dream of floating figures in tattered clothes, of grass that moves with its own will, of a voice calling my name across endless miles of prairie. Sometimes I wake up with the taste of limestone dust in my mouth, or the smell of decay clinging to my sheets. The doctors say it's PTSD from my survival experience, that the mind creates elaborate fantasies to cope with trauma. They've given me medication, referred me to specialists, suggested I join a support group for people who've survived wilderness emergencies. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing from the south, I can hear them calling. The voices of the prairie's other victims, still trying to lure new prey into their eternal trap. They know where I live now. They know I escaped, and they're still hungry. I've started sleeping with the lights on, and I never go anywhere alone after dark. I've moved twice since my experience at Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve, but the dreams follow me wherever I go. Kansas has other wild places, other patches of native grass where something ancient and patient might be waiting. Sometimes I wonder if I really did escape, or if I'm still floating there in the darkness, another smiling puppet helping to maintain the prairie's terrible harvest. Maybe this life I think I'm living is just another kind of trap, another way for the entity to feed on my fear and despair. But then morning comes, and the sun burns away the doubt along with the shadows. I'm alive. I'm free. I escaped. At least, that's what I tell myself. The only thing I know for certain is that I'll never go camping again. There are some kinds of solitude that aren't worth the risk, some forms of peace that come at too high a price. The tallgrass prairie is still there, still swaying in the endless Kansas wind, still waiting for the next lonely soul to wander off the marked trail. And somewhere in its depths, wearing clothes that were once mine, there might be another Jennifer Williams, smiling that horrible smile and calling out to future victims, "Come out and play. Come see what I've found." I hope I never find out for sure. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Tallgrass Prairie National Reserve, about 15 miles southwest of Strong City, Kansas, in October of last year. The idea for the camping trip came from Sarah, my girlfriend of 3 years, who'd been stressed about her promotion at the accounting firm. "I need to disconnect completely," she'd said, scrolling through photos of the endless grasslands online. No cell towers, no internet, just us and nature. Our friend Dennis Bell had agreed to join us, bringing along his golden retriever, Ranger, and his girlfriend Amanda Wright. I should have paid more attention to the warnings. The locals in Strong City weren't exactly welcoming when we stopped for supplies. The elderly clerk at Morrison's General Store gave us a long look when Dennis mentioned we were heading to the old Flint Hills backcountry near the abandoned settlement of Bazaar Springs. "Folks don't usually camp out that way," the man said, his weathered hands gripping the counter. "Not since the Hendricks family." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Just be careful out there. Prairie can play tricks on you." We laughed it off. 4 adults, 1 dog, plenty of supplies, and GPS coordinates locked in. What could go wrong? The drive out took us through rolling hills covered in 6-foot-tall prairie grass that rustled like whispers in the October wind. Ancient limestone outcroppings jutted from the earth like broken teeth, and the sky stretched endlessly overhead, a dome of gray clouds that seemed to press down on us. We set up camp in a small clearing near what remained of Bazaar Springs. Just a few crumbling stone foundations and a rusted windmill that creaked incessantly in the breeze. The place had been abandoned since the 1930s, according to Dennis's research, though he couldn't find much about why everyone had left. "Probably just economic," Amanda said, unpacking her sleeping bag. She was always the practical one, an engineer who approached everything with logic. "Small towns die all the time out here." Sarah seemed unusually quiet as we pitched our tents, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. When I asked if she was okay, she forced a smile. "Just tired from the drive. This place feels empty, doesn't it?" She was right. Despite the vastness of the prairie, there was an oppressive quality to the silence. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Even Ranger seemed on edge, his ears constantly pricked and his head turning at sounds none of us could hear. That first night, we built a fire using dried grass and old fence posts we'd found scattered around the ruins. The flames danced normally at first, casting long shadows across the clearing. But as full darkness fell, something changed. The fire began to burn with an odd greenish tint, and the smoke seemed to move against the wind, curling in unnatural patterns. "Must be minerals in the wood," Dennis said, but his voice lacked conviction. Ranger refused to settle down, pacing the perimeter of our camp and occasionally letting out low, threatening growls directed at the darkness beyond our firelight. When Dennis tried to calm him, the dog backed away, hackles raised. "He's never acted like this," Dennis muttered. We tried to make light conversation, but it felt forced. The prairie around us seemed to be listening, waiting. Every rustle of grass sounded like footsteps. Every creak of the old windmill felt deliberate, like Morse code tapping out a message we couldn't understand. Around midnight, the temperature dropped suddenly. Not gradually the way it should on an autumn night, but all at once, like stepping into a freezer. Our breath began to fog and frost started forming on our gear. "That's not normal," Amanda said, checking her phone. The screen flickered erratically, showing impossible readings, temperatures jumping between 32 degrees and 97 degrees, compass spinning wildly, GPS showing our location as 3 different places simultaneously. "Electronics malfunction all the time out here," I said, though my own phone was doing the same thing. "Magnetic fields in the rock or something." But deep down, I knew this was different. Sarah was the first to hear the singing. It started soft, almost inaudible. A woman's voice carried on the wind, wordless and haunting. At first, we thought it might be other campers somewhere in the distance, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Do you guys hear that?" Sarah whispered. We all stopped talking, straining to listen. The singing continued, rising and falling like a lullaby, but there was something wrong with it. The melody was beautiful, but underneath it was a quality that made my skin crawl. A wrongness that my brain couldn't quite process. Ranger began to whine, pressing himself against Dennis's leg. "It's just wind through the grass," Dennis said, but he didn't sound convinced. The singing continued for maybe 10 minutes. then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even worse, complete and absolute, as if the entire prairie were holding its breath. We spent the rest of that night huddled around our dying fire, taking turns keeping watch. When dawn finally came, gray and cheerless, we were exhausted and on edge. But that's when we found the first sign that something was truly wrong. Our food was gone, not scattered by animals or torn apart by scavengers, simply gone. The cooler was still closed and latched, but empty. The sealed packages of trail mix and energy bars had vanished from our backpacks. Even the dog food was missing. "This doesn't make sense," Amanda said, checking and rechecking our supplies. "Nothing's been disturbed. The containers are exactly where we left them." Dennis suggested that maybe we'd forgotten to pack properly, but I knew better. I double-checked everything before we left. Sarah stood at the edge of our campsite, staring out at the grassland with an expression I'd never seen before. Not quite fear, but something deeper. Recognition, maybe. "We should leave," she said quietly. "Come on, it's probably just—" I started. "No." Her voice was firm. "Something's wrong here. Can't you feel it?" I could, we all could, but admitting it meant acknowledging that we were in real danger, and none of us wanted to face that possibility. Dennis made the decision for us. "One more night," he said. "If anything else weird happens, we'll pack up tomorrow morning." I wish to God we'd listened to Sarah. The second day was worse. Our compass started spinning wildly no matter which direction we faced. The GPS in my truck showed us moving when the vehicle was parked, our position jumping miles in seconds. The temperature continued to fluctuate dramatically. Sweating heat one moment, bitter cold the next. But the strangest thing was the grass itself. It seemed to be moving in patterns, not randomly with the wind, but in waves that radiated out from our campsite like ripples in a pond. And it was growing taller. Areas that had been 4 feet high the day before now towered over our heads. "Prairie grass doesn't grow that fast," Amanda said, but she was examining the stalks with professional interest rather than fear. The cellular structure would have to be completely different. Ranger had gotten worse too. He wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink, and kept trying to lead us away from the campsite. When Dennis ignored his signals, the dog began to howl, long, mournful sounds that echoed across the empty landscape. That afternoon, Dennis decided to explore the ruins of Bazaar Springs more thoroughly. "Maybe there's something in the old buildings that explains what happened here," he said. "I'll come with you," I offered, but he waved me off. "Nah, just a quick look around. Keep an eye on the girls and Ranger." He disappeared into the tall grass, following what might once have been a road toward the largest of the ruined foundations. We could hear him moving through the stalks for maybe 5 minutes, then nothing. An hour passed, then 2. "He should be back by now," Amanda said, pacing nervously. The ruins weren't more than a quarter mile away, clearly visible from our campsite. I called his name, my voice echoing strangely in the vast space. No answer. "I'm going to look for him," I announced, but Sarah grabbed my arm. "Don't split up," she said. "That's how people die in horror movies." "This isn't a movie, Sarah. Dennis could be hurt." But even as I said it, I knew she was right. Something about this place made me want to stick together, to not let anyone out of sight. We waited until sunset, calling Dennis's name every few minutes. Ranger had positioned himself at the edge of the campsite, facing the ruins, and was emitting a low, constant growl that raised the hair on my arms. Then, just as the last light was fading from the sky, we saw Dennis coming back. He emerged from the grass slowly, walking with an odd, measured gait. Even in the dim light, I could see something was wrong with his posture. Too straight, too deliberate, like someone concentrating very hard on appearing normal. "Dennis!" Amanda called out, relief evident in her voice. "Where have you been? We were worried sick." He didn't answer until he was almost back to the campsite. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded flat, emotionless. "Sorry, lost track of time." Amanda rushed to him but stopped short when she got close. I couldn't see her face, but her body language changed completely. Tense, wary. "Honey, are you okay?" she asked. "You look pale." Dennis smiled, but it was wrong somehow. Too wide. Lasting too long. His eyes didn't seem to focus properly, staring just slightly past us rather than at us. "I'm fine," he said. "Just tired." But he wasn't fine. As he moved into the firelight, I could see that his clothes were covered in a fine, powdery dust that seemed to shimmer faintly. His skin looked waxy, almost translucent, and there was a smell coming from him, sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in water. Ranger backed away from him, whimpering. "What did you find out there?" I asked. Dennis turned to look at me, and I had to suppress a shudder. His expression was completely blank, as if he were looking through me rather than at me. "Nothing much," he said. "Just old stones, old bones." The way he said "old bones" made my blood run cold. We tried to act normal for the rest of the evening, but the atmosphere was toxic with unspoken fear. Dennis sat staring into the fire without blinking, occasionally making comments that didn't quite make sense in context. When Amanda tried to touch him, he pulled away with a sharp, jerky movement that looked almost involuntary. "I think we should head back tomorrow," Sarah whispered to me when Dennis had gone to his tent. "Agreed. Something happened to him out there." "Michael," she said, gripping my hand tightly. "What if that's not Dennis?" The thought had occurred to me too, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real and terrifying. "Don't be ridiculous," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. We didn't sleep much that night. Through the thin walls of our tent, we could hear Dennis moving around constantly. Not the normal sounds of someone trying to get comfortable, but a repetitive rustling, like he was doing the same movement over and over again. Around 3 a.m., the singing started again. This time, it was closer, and I could make out individual voices, maybe a dozen women, harmonizing in minor keys that seemed to bypass my ears and go straight to my nervous system. The melody was hypnotic, beautiful in a way that made me want to walk out into the darkness and find its source. I felt Sarah's hand on my shoulder. "Don't," she whispered. I hadn't realized I was moving toward the tent flap. The singing continued for what felt like hours, growing louder and more complex. Other sounds began to join it. Children laughing, men calling to each other in a language I didn't recognize, the sound of construction or demolition. It was as if the entire abandoned settlement was coming back to life around us. Ranger had gone completely silent, huddled as far from Dennis's tent as possible. When morning came, Dennis was gone. His tent was still zipped shut from the inside, but empty. His sleeping bag showed no sign of having been slept in. It was laid out perfectly, as if for display. His clothes were folded neatly in the corner, but covered in that same strange, shimmering dust. "This is impossible," Amanda said, examining the tent. He couldn't have gotten out without unzipping it. But he was gone, and with him, any pretense that this was a normal camping trip. We packed up quickly, throwing our gear into my truck with desperate efficiency. But when I turned the key, nothing happened. The engine was completely dead, not even attempting to turn over. I popped the hood and immediately saw the problem. Every wire had been severed cleanly, as if with surgical precision. The cuts were so perfect they looked almost decorative. "We need to hike out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's about 15 miles to the main road." "In which direction?" Amanda asked, holding up her compass. The needle was spinning lazily, never settling on any particular heading. I checked my phone, though I already knew what I'd find. No signal, GPS showing our location as the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Sarah was standing at the edge of our campsite, staring out at the endless grass. "The road we came in on," she said quietly. "I can't see it anymore." She was right. The dirt track that had brought us here had vanished completely, replaced by unbroken prairie that stretched to the horizon. "Roads don't just disappear," Amanda said. but she sounded like she was trying to convince herself as much as us. I shouldered my backpack, taking inventory of our supplies. We had maybe 2 days' worth of water, some energy bars that had somehow survived the mysterious disappearance of our other food, and a basic first aid kit. Not much for a potentially long journey through unknown terrain. We'll head east, I decided. Follow the sun. Eventually we'll hit a road or a farm. But as we started walking, I began to understand the true horror of our situation. The landscape around us was changing. Not obviously, not in ways you could point to and say, that's different, but subtly, constantly. A limestone outcropping that had been on our right would suddenly be on our left. Hills that we'd climbed would appear ahead of us again, identical but impossible. And the grass was getting taller. By midday, the prairie stalks towered 8 feet above our heads, creating a claustrophobic maze of green walls that rustled and whispered around us. The paths between them seemed to shift when we weren't looking directly at them, leading us in circles or dead ends. Ranger stayed close, no longer the confident, happy dog he'd been 2 days earlier. He moved like a beaten animal, flinching at every sound and constantly looking over his shoulder. "This is like that story," Sarah said during one of our brief rest stops. "The one about the children who went into the corn and never came out." "That's fiction." "Sarah." "Is it? Because I'm starting to think we're never getting out of here either." I wanted to reassure her, but the words stuck in my throat. We'd been walking for hours and seemed no closer to civilization than when we started. If anything, we seemed to be moving deeper into the wilderness, the grass growing taller and the silence more complete with each step. That's when we heard Dennis calling for help. His voice came from somewhere ahead of us, muffled by the grass but unmistakably his. "Amanda! Michael! Help me! I'm hurt!" Amanda immediately started running toward the sound, but I grabbed her arm. "Wait," I said. "Something's not right. He's calling for help. Listen to his voice. Really listen." She stopped, tilting her head. Dennis was still calling, but now that we were paying attention, there was something mechanical about it. The same words repeated in exactly the same tone and inflection, like a recording played on loop. "Help me! I'm hurt! Help me! I'm hurt!" And underneath his voice, barely audible, we could hear something else. Laughter, high-pitched and gleeful, like children playing a particularly cruel game. "That's not Dennis," Sarah whispered. But Amanda was already pushing past me, crashing through the grass toward the voice. "I don't care. If there's even a chance—" Her scream cut through the air like a blade. I ran after her, fighting through the thick stalks that seemed to grab at my clothes and equipment. Sarah was right behind me, Ranger barking frantically. We found Amanda in a small clearing maybe 50 yards from where we'd been standing. She was on her knees, staring at something I couldn't immediately see. Her face was white with shock, her mouth moving but no sound coming out. Then I saw what she was looking at. It was Dennis. Or what had been Dennis. He was hanging from the twisted branches of a dead cottonwood tree that definitely hadn't been there moments before. But he'd been there for a long time. Weeks, maybe months. His body was mummified, desiccated like something left in the desert sun. His clothes hung in tatters, and his skin was the color of old parchment. But his mouth was moving. Even in death, or whatever state he was in, Dennis was still calling for help in that mechanical, recorded voice. "Help me! I'm hurt! Help me! I'm hurt!" Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We have to get out of here now." But as we turned to leave, we found ourselves surrounded. They emerged from the grass like something out of a fever dream, the people of Bizarre Springs, or what they'd become. Men, women, and children, all wearing the clothes of settlers from decades past, all bearing the same mummified appearance as Dennis. Their eyes were empty sockets, but they moved with purpose, forming a circle around us with slow, deliberate steps. And they were singing that haunting melody we'd heard for the past 2 nights. Amanda was still on her knees, catatonic with shock. I pulled her to her feet, putting myself between her and the advancing figures. "What do you want?" I shouted, though I wasn't sure any of them could hear me over their singing. One of them, a woman in a faded blue dress, stepped forward. When she spoke, her voice was like wind through dry leaves. "You came to our place," she said. "Now you stay, like the others." "Others?" She gestured toward the dead tree, and I saw what I'd missed before. There were more bodies hanging from its branches, dozens of them, in various states of decay. Campers, hikers, travelers who'd made the same mistake we had. "The grass feeds," the woman continued. "We tend it. We harvest what it needs." That's when I understood. The settlement hadn't been abandoned. It had been transformed. The people had become something else, servants to whatever lived in the prairie itself, and we were about to join them. The circle was tightening. I could smell the sweet, cloying scent of decay coming from their bodies. Sarah was hyperventilating beside me, and Amanda seemed completely catatonic. That's when Ranger saved our lives. The dog suddenly erupted in a frenzy of barking and snarling, launching himself at the nearest figure, a tall man in overalls who might have been a farmer in life. The impact knocked the creature backward, and in the brief gap that opened in their circle, I saw our chance. "Run!" I screamed, grabbing both women and pulling them toward the opening. We crashed through the grass, branches and stalks tearing at our clothes and skin. Behind us, I could hear the settlers giving chase, not running, but moving with that same measured, deliberate pace. They didn't need to hurry. They knew we had nowhere to go, but Ranger had bought us precious seconds, and I was determined not to waste them. We ran blindly through the maze of grass, taking turns at random, following no plan except to put distance between us and our pursuers. The prairie seemed to fight us at every step, paths closing off, roots catching our feet, branches whipping across our faces. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, we stumbled into another clearing. This one was different, smaller, more natural, with no sign of human habitation. But in the center was something that made my heart sink. Our campsite, exactly as we'd left it that morning, complete with our abandoned gear and my disabled truck. "We're going in circles," Amanda said, her voice hollow with despair. "No," Sarah said, examining the site more closely. "Look at the fire pit. We scattered those ashes before we left." She was right. The fire pit was clean, filled with fresh kindling and logs arranged exactly as we'd had them on our first night. "It's a trap," I realized. "They're herding us back here." But why? What was so special about this particular spot? I got my answer when I noticed the windmill. The rusty old structure that had been creaking constantly since our arrival was now perfectly still, and hanging from its blades were 3 nooses swaying gently in the breeze, waiting for us. "They're going to hang us," Amanda whispered, "just like Dennis." "No," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "No, they're not." I started gathering up our scattered equipment, looking for anything that might help us fight back or escape. The flare gun from our emergency kit, the camping hatchet Dennis had brought for chopping wood, a can of bear spray Amanda had insisted on packing despite my protests that there were no bears in Kansas. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked. "Getting ready to fight." "Fight them? Michael, they're already dead." "Then we'll kill them again." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all I had. The settlers were still pursuing us. I could hear their singing getting closer, accompanied now by the sound of many feet moving through the grass. We had maybe 5 minutes before they reached the clearing. I loaded the flare gun and handed the bear spray to Sarah. Amanda got the hatchet, though I wasn't sure she was in any state to use it effectively. "When they come," I said, "we make our stand here, fight our way through them and try to reach higher ground. Maybe we can see the real road from up there." It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all we had left. The settlers emerged from the grass like actors taking the stage. There were more of them now, maybe 30 or 40, including several children who should have been heartbreaking in their youth but were instead terrifying in their decay. They surrounded the clearing but didn't immediately advance, just stood there swaying slightly and humming that awful melody. The woman in blue stepped forward again. In the daylight, I could see that her dress had once been beautiful, hand-sewn with intricate embroidery. Now it was stained and rotting, held together more by habit than thread. "You fought well," she said, almost admiringly. "Most don't try to run. They just stand there and let it happen." "What are you?" I demanded. "We are what the grass made us, what it will make you in time. The grass isn't alive." She smiled, revealing teeth like broken pottery. "Isn't it? Look around you. Really look." I did, and felt my sanity slip another notch. The prairie grass wasn't just growing, it was moving with deliberate intent, stalks bending toward us like fingers, roots emerging from the ground to form crude shapes, and in the patterns they made, I could almost see faces, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all staring at us with vegetative hunger. "The grass has been here longer than memory," the woman continued. "It was old when the first people came, and it will be here when the last star dies. We tend it, we feed it, and in return, it gives us purpose." "What kind of purpose requires murder?" "Not murder, transformation. You'll understand soon enough." The circle began to close again, but this time I was ready. I raised the flare gun and fired it directly at the woman in blue. The projectile struck her in the chest and exploded in a shower of red sparks. She staggered backward, her dress catching fire, but she didn't scream. Instead, she laughed, a sound like wind through a graveyard. "Fire," she said, looking down at the flames consuming her body. "We remember fire. It was fire that made us what we are." That's when I understood the final piece of the puzzle. Bazaar Springs hadn't been abandoned. It had burned. A prairie fire, maybe started by lightning or human carelessness, had swept through the settlement and killed everyone. But somehow, the grass had brought them back, transformed them into its servants. And fire was what they feared most. I grabbed a burning brand from the woman's dress and thrust it into the nearest stalks of grass. The reaction was immediate and terrifying. A sound like screaming filled the air, not from the settlers but from the prairie itself. The grass began to writhe and retreat, creating a widening circle of clear ground around us. "The grass!" I shouted to Sarah and Amanda. "Burn the grass!" We started a dozen small fires, using everything we could find as fuel: our abandoned camping gear, dried stalks, even pages torn from our notebooks. The flames spread quickly through the dry vegetation, and with each new blaze, the settlers seemed to weaken. Their movements became more erratic, their singing more discordant. But we'd also trapped ourselves. The fires were spreading faster than we could control them, forming a ring of flame that grew closer with each passing second. Soon, we'd be caught between the burning grass and our supernatural pursuers. "There," Sarah pointed toward a gap in the flames where the fire hadn't quite caught. "We can get through." We ran for it, but the woman in blue moved to block our path. Half her body was charred now, but she was still standing, still smiling that terrible smile. "You cannot leave," she said. "The grass has tasted you. It will follow you anywhere now." I swung the camping hatchet at her neck. The blade passed through with surprisingly little resistance, and her head rolled away into the flames, but her body remained standing, arms reaching for us with burned fingers. Amanda finally snapped out of her paralysis, screaming and swinging her own makeshift weapon, a tent stake she'd grabbed from our abandoned campsite. She drove it through the headless body's chest, and finally, mercifully, it collapsed. We ran through the gap in the flames, our clothes smoking, skin blistered by the heat. The prairie beyond was still untouched by fire, but I could see it responding to our presence. Stalks bending toward us, roots emerging from the soil like grasping fingers. "Don't stop running," I yelled, though I could barely breathe through the smoke and exertion. Behind us, the fires were spreading across the entire clearing. The other settlers were caught in the blaze, their mummified bodies going up like torches. But even as they burned, they kept singing. their voices growing higher and more discordant until they sounded less like human voices and more like the screaming of animals. We ran through the grass maze for what felt like hours, the stalks growing shorter and thinner as we moved away from the heart of whatever lived in that place. Finally, we stumbled onto a dirt road. Not the one we'd originally taken, but a road nonetheless. A few hundred yards down the track, we found a farmhouse with lights in the windows. The elderly couple who lived there took us in, called the police, and eventually drove us back to Strong City after we'd given our statements. The authorities found nothing. Our campsite, the ruins of Bizarre Springs, even the dirt road we'd taken to get there, all gone. The GPS coordinates Dennis had saved led to empty prairie with no sign of human habitation, past or present. They declared Dennis a missing person, though they clearly suspected Amanda and I of foul play. We had no bodies, no evidence, no credible explanation for what had happened. Just the word of 3 traumatized campers who told a story that sounded like a shared psychotic break. Amanda never recovered. She spent 3 months in a psychiatric facility after suffering what doctors called a complete dissociative episode. When she was finally released, she moved back east to live with her sister. I get a Christmas card from her every year, but we don't talk about what happened in Kansas. Sarah and I stayed together for another 6 months, but the experience had changed us both too fundamentally. We were different people now, marked by something we couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't been there. Eventually, she moved to Colorado, claiming she needed to be closer to mountains. Solid, permanent things that couldn't shift or change when you weren't looking. I still live in the same apartment I had before the trip, still work the same job, but I'm not the same person who drove out to Kansas that October weekend. I can't be around tall grass without feeling dizzy. I avoid camping, hiking, anywhere that puts me too far from concrete and steel and other human beings. And sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing just right, I hear singing. It's faint, barely audible over the sounds of the city, but it's there. That same haunting melody we heard in the prairie, growing a little closer each time. The woman in blue told us the grass would follow us anywhere, and I'm beginning to think she was right. Last week, I noticed something growing in the cracks of the sidewalk outside my building. Just ordinary weeds, probably, but they're tall for city growth, and they move in patterns that remind me of those terrible days in Kansas. I've been thinking about moving somewhere cold, where nothing grows. Alaska, maybe, or northern Canada. Somewhere the ground stays frozen year-round and the grass can't follow. But I know it's probably too late for that. Whatever lives in the tallgrass prairie has marked us, claimed us. It's patient. It can wait decades if necessary. Eventually, we'll all return to feed it, just like Dennis did. Just like everyone else who's ever made the mistake of camping too far from civilization in the wrong part of Kansas. The singing is getting louder now, and I think I can see movement in the shadows outside my window. Long, thin shapes swaying in the streetlight, reaching up toward my third-floor apartment like fingers made of vegetation. I should run, but where's the point? You can't outrun something that grows everywhere, something that's part of the earth itself. So I'm writing this down instead, leaving a record for whoever finds it. A warning, maybe, though I doubt anyone will believe it any more than the police believed us. Don't go to the tallgrass prairie, especially not the remote areas around where Bizarre Springs used to be. Don't camp in places that feel too empty, too quiet. And if you hear singing on the wind, run. Run and don't look back. Because if you do, you might see what's coming for you through the grass. The singing is right outside now. I can see faces in the weeds growing up the side of the building. Dennis, the woman in blue, dozens of others I don't recognize. All of them smiling, all of them calling my name. I think it's time to go. My name is Jennifer Williams and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Flint Hills of Kansas near the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve in October of last year. I'd been planning this camping trip with my coworkers for months. After the nightmare that was our quarterly audit season, we all desperately needed to disconnect from spreadsheets and conference calls. Sarah Rodriguez from accounting, Michael Brown from IT, and Thomas Davis from marketing. We'd become unlikely friends through late nights and shared misery at Peterson and Associates. "The middle of nowhere sounds perfect right about now," Sarah had said when I suggested the Flint Hills. "No cell towers, no emails, no clients calling at midnight." We'd chosen a remote section near Fox Creek, about 15 miles south of Council Grove. The area was known for its pristine tallgrass prairie and limestone outcroppings that created natural windbreaks for camping. Thomas had done his research and found what looked like a perfect spot on satellite images, a clearing surrounded by rolling hills and scattered post oak trees. The drive from Wichita took us through increasingly desolate countryside. We passed abandoned farmhouses with sagging roofs and rusted silos standing like monuments to failed dreams. The GPS lost signal twice, forcing us to navigate by the hand-drawn map Thomas had sketched from online sources. "Are we sure this is right?" Sarah asked as we turned onto a dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere. Tall prairie grass pressed against both sides of my Honda Pilot, creating a golden tunnel that stretched endlessly ahead. "According to the coordinates, it should be just another mile," Thomas said, squinting at his phone's offline maps. The screen flickered between showing our location and complete blankness. Michael, who'd been unusually quiet during the 3-hour drive, finally spoke up. "My phone died 20 minutes ago. Just went from 40% battery to nothing." I glanced at my own phone. The battery indicator showed 30%, but even as I watched it drop to 25, then 20. "That's weird. I charged it fully this morning." "Must be something about being out here," Sarah said, though she looked uneasy. "No cell towers to connect to, so the phones work overtime trying to find signal." We found the clearing exactly where Thomas's coordinates indicated. It was beautiful in a stark, wind-swept way, a natural amphitheater surrounded by limestone ridges and scattered with the bleached bones of long-dead cattle. The grass here was shorter, trampled down by whatever animals used this as a watering hole before the creek had dried up years ago. "Perfect," I said, though something about the place felt off. Maybe it was the complete silence. No birds, no insects, just the whisper of wind through grass. "Let's get camp set up before dark." We worked efficiently, having practiced this routine on previous trips. Sarah and I erected the 2 tents while Michael gathered stones for a fire ring and Thomas scouted for firewood among the scattered oak trees. The sun was already low on the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of amber and rust. "Hey," Thomas called from the edge of our clearing. "Come look at this." We gathered around what appeared to be an old foundation, limestone blocks arranged in a rough rectangle, mostly buried under decades of accumulated soil and grass. Rusted metal fragments poked through the earth, and I could make out what might have been part of a well or cistern. "Homestead," Michael said, nudging a piece of rotted wood with his boot. "Probably from the 1800s. A lot of settlers tried to make a go of it out here before the Dust Bowl finished them off." Sarah shivered, though the evening air was still warm. Creepy to think about them living way out here, miles from anyone. "Different times," Thomas said. "People were tougher back then." As darkness fell, we built our fire and settled in with beer and the steaks I'd brought in a cooler. The flames cast dancing shadows on the limestone ridges around us, and for a while, the conversation flowed easily. We talked about work, about plans for the holidays, about anything except the growing feeling that we were being watched. I first noticed it around 10 o'clock, a tickling sensation between my shoulder blades, the primitive awareness that something was observing us from the darkness beyond our fire's light. I tried to dismiss it as nerves. I'd always been slightly agoraphobic, uncomfortable in wide-open spaces, but the feeling persisted. "Anyone else hear that?" Michael asked suddenly. We all went quiet, listening. At first, there was nothing but the crackling of our fire and the eternal whisper of wind through grass. Then I heard it, a low, humming sound, almost below the threshold of hearing. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Wind through the rocks," Thomas said, but he didn't sound convinced. "That doesn't sound like wind," Sarah said. She'd moved closer to the fire, her arms wrapped around her knees. The humming continued for several minutes, rising and falling in pitch like some kind of organic machinery. Then it stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy and expectant. "I'm going to check the perimeter," I said, grabbing a flashlight. "Don't go alone," Sarah said quickly. Michael stood up. "I'll come with you." We walked to the edge of the clearing, our flashlight beams probing the darkness between the oak trees. The prairie grass rustled and whispered around us, but there was no sign of whatever might have been making the sound. "Probably just settling limestone," Michael said. "Rock formations make weird noises when the temperature changes." But as we turned to head back to the fire, my flashlight beam caught something that made my blood freeze. About 50 yards away, partially hidden behind a limestone outcropping, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, unnaturally still, and in the brief moment before my light swept past it, I could have sworn it was wearing old-fashioned clothing, a long coat or dress that hung to the ground. "Did you see that?" I whispered. "See what?" I swung the flashlight back, but the figure was gone. The limestone outcropping stood empty, casting twisted shadows in all directions. "There was someone there," I said, "behind that rock." Michael played his own light over the area. "I don't see anything. You sure?" I wasn't sure of anything anymore. The agoraphobia was kicking in full force now, that familiar sensation of being exposed and vulnerable in too much open space. But this was different. Worse. This felt like being prey. We returned to the fire where Sarah and Thomas were huddled close together, speaking in low voices. "Everything okay?" Thomas asked. "Fine," I lied. "Probably just a deer or something." But sleep was impossible. Even after we banked the fire and retreated to our tents, Sarah and I sharing one, the guys in the other, I lay awake listening to the sounds of the prairie night. The wind seemed to carry voices, indistinct whispers that might have been imagination or might have been something else entirely. Around 3 a.m, I heard Sarah's sleeping bag rustling. "Can't sleep either?" I whispered. No response. I listened more carefully and realized the sound wasn't rustling. It was the zipper on the tent's entrance being slowly, quietly opened. I sat up, reaching for my flashlight. "Sarah?" The sleeping bag beside me was empty, unzipped from the inside. I scrambled out of my own bag and through the tent flap, playing my light around the clearing. Sarah was nowhere to be seen, but her footprints were clearly visible in the soft earth, leading away from camp toward the limestone ridges. "Sarah," I called softly, not wanting to wake the guys but growing increasingly panicked. The footprints continued into the darkness, disappearing where the ground became rocky. I was about to shout louder when I heard her voice from somewhere in the night. "Jennifer, is that you?" The voice was coming from the direction of the old homestead foundation. I followed it, my flashlight beam dancing wildly as I stumbled over rocks and holes in the ground. "Sarah, where are you?" "Over here. I found something." I found her standing beside the old well, staring down into the black opening. She was fully dressed, her hair neatly combed as if she'd been awake for hours. "What are you doing out here?" I asked. She turned to look at me and something cold crawled down my spine. Her expression was perfectly calm, almost serene, but her eyes reflected the flashlight beam like an animal's. "I heard them calling," she said. "The family that used to live here. They're still here, Jennifer. They're hungry." "Sarah, you're scaring me. Let's go back to camp." She smiled then, a wide, unnatural expression that showed too many teeth. "They want us to stay. They want us to join them. It's so much better down there. No spreadsheets, no deadlines, no quarterly audits." I backed away, my heart hammering. This wasn't Sarah, not the Sarah who complained about everything, who always had a sarcastic comment ready, who'd been my closest friend at the office for 3 years. "Come look," she said, gesturing toward the well. "Just look down and you'll understand." Instead, I turned and ran, crashing through the prairie grass back toward camp. Behind me, I heard Sarah, or whatever was wearing Sarah's face, laughing softly. I burst into the guys' tent, shaking them awake. "We have to leave," I gasped. "Something's wrong with Sarah. Something's very wrong." Thomas sat up, immediately alert. "What do you mean, wrong?" I tried to explain what I'd seen, how Sarah had acted, but the words sounded crazy even to me. Michael was already getting dressed, grabbing his flashlight. "Where is she now?" he asked. "By the old foundation. But don't go alone. We all need to stick together." The three of us approached the homestead ruins cautiously, but Sarah was gone. The well opening gaped like a mouth in the limestone, and when Michael shined his light down into it, we could see water about 20 feet below, impossible since this area had been in drought for years. "Sarah," Thomas called. "Sarah, where are you?" The answer came from behind us, making us all jump. "I'm right here." We spun around to find Sarah standing at the edge of the clearing, perfectly normal except for the dirt on her clothes and the way she blinked too slowly, like a lizard. "Where were you?" I demanded. "I went for a walk. Couldn't sleep." Her voice was flat, emotionless. "The night is so beautiful here, so peaceful." "You scared us," Thomas said. "Don't wander off like that." Sarah nodded, but she was staring at the well with an expression of longing that made my skin crawl. "Of course, I'm sorry, I wasn't thinking clearly." We all went back to our tents, but I didn't sleep. I lay listening to Sarah's breathing, which seemed too regular, too controlled. Twice I heard her sleeping bag rustle, and twice I checked to make sure she was still there. Each time she appeared to be asleep, but her eyes were open just a crack, reflecting the faint starlight. Morning brought no relief. Sarah moved through the routine of breaking camp like a sleepwalker, her responses delayed and mechanical. When Thomas made a joke about the terrible coffee, she laughed, but the sound came 2 beats too late, as if she had to remember how laughter was supposed to work. "You feeling okay?" Michael asked her as we loaded the car. "I feel wonderful," she said, and the word wonderful stretched out too long like she was savoring the taste of it. I suggested we head back to town early, make up some excuse about a family emergency or work crisis. But as we drove away from the clearing, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror at Sarah. She was staring out the back window with that same serene expression, watching the prairie recede behind us. "Turn around," she said suddenly. "What?" "Turn around. We forgot something." "We checked everything twice," Thomas said. "We didn't forget anything." Sarah's reflection in the mirror smiled. "We forgot to say goodbye." "Goodbye to what?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. "To the family. They were so kind to invite us. It's rude to leave without saying goodbye." A chill ran down my spine as I realized that Sarah's breathing had stopped. She sat perfectly still in the back seat, not even the rise and fall of her chest, but she continued talking as if nothing was wrong. "They showed me such beautiful things," she continued in that flat, dreamy voice. "Down in the dark where it's cool and quiet, where there's no hunger anymore because you become the hunger." I pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to reach the main highway and civilization. But the dirt road seemed to stretch on forever, the familiar landmarks passing again and again as if we were driving in circles. "This isn't right," Michael said, studying his dead phone's GPS. "We should have reached the highway 10 minutes ago." I looked at the odometer. We'd driven nearly 30 miles, but according to my map, the clearing was only 15 miles from the main road. "Stop the car," Sarah said. "No. Stop the car, Jennifer." Her voice had changed, becoming deeper, more commanding. When I glanced in the mirror again, her eyes were completely black, like the water in that impossible well. "The family is calling us back," she said. "They need us. They're so hungry, and it's been so long since anyone came to visit." Thomas twisted around in his seat. "Sarah, you're freaking us out. What's wrong with you?" She tilted her head at an unnatural angle, studying him with those black eyes. "Nothing's wrong with me. I'm better now. I'm perfect. You could be perfect too, Thomas. You could join us." Michael fumbled for the door handle. "Let me out. I'll walk back." But the door wouldn't open. None of the doors would open. The electric locks clicked repeatedly as I jabbed at the button. But we remained trapped inside. "The family doesn't like it when guests leave early," Sarah said. She was leaning forward now, her face inches from Thomas's shoulder. "It hurts their feelings, makes them angry." I could smell something coming from her, not just the earthy scent of prairie soil, but something else. Something sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. "What do you want?" I asked. "Go back," she whispered. "Go back to the clearing. The family is waiting. They have such wonderful things to show you. Down in the dark where—" Thomas grabbed the steering wheel, yanking hard to the left. The car lurched off the dirt road and into the prairie grass, bouncing violently over hidden rocks and holes. Sarah shrieked. Not in fear, but in rage, a sound that no human throat should have been able to make. I fought for control as we crashed through a stand of oak trees, branches scraping against the windows. Behind us, I could hear Sarah changing, the sounds of bone and cartilage shifting, reforming into something that had never been human. The car came to rest against a limestone outcropping, the engine dead. Through my cracked windshield, I could see we were back at the clearing. The old homestead foundation lay just ahead, and the well opening seemed to pulse with a darkness deeper than night. "Run!" I gasped. Michael and Thomas were already out, having somehow gotten their door to work. I scrambled after them, but something grabbed my ankle, fingers that were too long with too many joints. I looked back to see what Sarah had become. Her face was a pale mockery of human features, stretched and distorted like clay that had been worked by clumsy hands. Her mouth opened too wide, revealing rows of teeth that spiraled down her throat like the inside of a lamprey. "The family wants to meet you," she said in a voice like grinding stone. I kicked at her transformed hand, feeling bones crack under my heel. Her grip loosened just enough for me to pull free, and I ran after Thomas and Michael. We reached the edge of the clearing as the sun began to set, painting the sky the color of dried blood. The tall grass around us rustled with movement that had nothing to do with wind. "The car keys," Thomas panted. "Where are the keys?" I patted my pockets, but they were empty. The keys were still in the ignition, back in the car, where Sarah waited with her impossible smile and her spiraling teeth. From the direction of the homestead came a sound like singing, multiple voices raised in harmony, but the melody was wrong, composed of notes that human ears weren't meant to hear. The grass began to bend toward the old foundation, as if the earth itself was tilting. "The well," Michael said. "Something's coming up from the well." I could see them now, pale figures emerging from the dark opening, their clothes rotting remnants of 19th century homesteader garb. Men, women, children, all of them wearing the same serene expression that Sarah had shown. All of them moving with that too slow, too deliberate gait of things that had forgotten how to be alive. "This way," I said, leading us toward the limestone ridges. Maybe we could find shelter in the rocks, wait until daylight, figure out how to get back to the car. But the prairie had changed. Where there had been open grassland during our arrival, now there were obstacles, sinkholes that opened like mouths, limestone formations that shifted when we weren't looking directly at them, stands of oak trees that grew closer together with each step we took. We were being herded, driven back toward the clearing like cattle. They're not just dead, I realized as we huddled behind a wind-carved boulder. There's something else, something that was here before the homesteaders, before anyone. They just took their shapes. Thomas was hyperventilating, his claustrophobia triggered by the way the landscape seemed to be closing in around us. "Can't breathe," he gasped. "Getting smaller. Everything's getting smaller." The singing was louder now, and I could make out words in a language that might have been English once, worn smooth by decades of repetition underground. Come down, to the cool, dark ground, where the hungry wait and the lost are found, where the prairie keeps what the prairie claims and the thirsty earth drinks the morning rains. Michael grabbed my arm. "Look." Sarah was walking toward us through the grass, but she wasn't alone. The Homesteader family flanked her, a man in a rotting suit, a woman in a tattered dress, children whose faces were masks of decay. Behind them came others, figures from different eras, all wearing the clothes they'd died in. "You can't leave," Sarah called, her voice echoing strangely in the still air. "No one leaves. The prairie is hungry, and you're part of it now." I thought about the foundation we'd found, the rusted metal, the bones scattered around the clearing. How many camping trips had ended here? How many travelers had taken the wrong turn down that dirt road and never made it back to the highway? But I also remembered something else. The rotted wood Michael had kicked, the way some of the metal fragments had looked fresh despite being buried. These things could be hurt, could be damaged. "The fire," I whispered. "We need to get back to our fire." "It's out," Thomas said. "Not the coals. There might still be coals." We broke from cover, running in a wide arc around the approaching figures. Sarah shrieked again at that inhuman sound of rage, and the singing became discordant, angry. Our campfire was cold, but I kicked through the ashes until I found a few red embers still glowing beneath the gray. Working frantically, I gathered dry grass and twigs, blowing on the coals until flames caught. The figures stopped at the edge of the firelight, hissing like cats. In the dancing light, I could see they were even more wrong than I'd thought. Their limbs were too long, their joints bent backward. Their skin had the waxy translucence of something that had been underwater too long. Fire hurts them, Michael realized. I grabbed a burning branch from our rebuilt fire and swept it toward the nearest figure, one of the Homesteader children. It shrieked and fell back, its face dissolving like melting wax. "Get more wood," I ordered. "Build it up." We worked desperately, feeding our fire until it blazed high enough to push the creatures back to the edge of the clearing. But I could see more of them emerging from the well, and our wood supply was limited. Sarah stood just beyond the light, no longer bothering to maintain her human appearance. Her limbs had elongated, her fingers ending in bone-white claws. Her face a shifting mass of features that settled into different expressions like oil on water. "You can't burn forever," she said in a voice like grinding glass. "The fire will die, and we'll still be here. We'll always be here." She was right. We had enough wood for maybe an hour, and then we'd be back where we started, trapped in the dark with things that had once been human. But as I stared into the flames, I remembered something from the research I'd done about the area. The Flint Hills were famous for their prairie fires, massive blazes that had swept across the grassland for thousands of years, keeping the ecosystem healthy by burning away dead vegetation. The grass around us was dry from the autumn drought, brittle and ready to burn. "Get to the car," I told Thomas and Michael. "When I start the fire, run for the car." "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you." I took a burning branch and touched it to the prairie grass at the edge of our clearing. It caught immediately, flames racing outward in all directions with a hungry, crackling sound. The creatures screamed as fire surrounded them, their forms dissolving and reforming in the smoke and heat. Sarah made one last desperate lunge toward me, her claws reaching for my throat, but the flames caught her borrowed form and she collapsed into ash and shadow. I ran for the car, the prairie fire spreading behind me in a wave of orange light. Thomas already had the engine running. Somehow the keys had appeared in the ignition, and Michael was holding the back door open. We drove through walls of flame and smoke, following the dirt road by memory and instinct. Behind us, the fire consumed everything: the grass, the old homestead foundation, the impossible well that couldn't have existed in this drought-stricken landscape. We didn't stop until we reached Council Grove, where we sat in a 24-hour diner drinking coffee and trying to make sense of what we'd experienced. The waitress told us the prairie fire had been visible from town, a red glow on the southern horizon that lasted most of the night. "Good thing it didn't spread further," she said, "though I can't imagine what started it. That area's been marked as a fire hazard for years because of all the old homesteads and unmarked graves. Unmarked graves. I thought about the bones scattered around our clearing, the metal fragments that might have been from other cars, other camping trips. We never talked about what happened that night, not to each other and not to anyone else. What would have been the point? Who would have believed us? But I kept track of the area through online news sources and local papers. The fire had burned over 3,000 acres before rain finally stopped it. In the aftermath, investigators found the remains of 17 vehicles dating back to the 1970s, all buried in what had once been our clearing. They also found bones, lots of bones. The official report blamed the disappearances on the remote location, suggesting that travelers had become lost in the prairie and died of exposure or accident. The bones were old, the report said, scattered by animals and weather. But I knew better. I knew that something had been feeding in that clearing for decades, something that wore the faces of its victims and called them back to join the family down in the dark. I quit Peterson & Associates 2 weeks later. Michael transferred to the Denver office and Thomas took early retirement. We never spoke again, as if maintaining our silence about that night required us to avoid each other entirely. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear Sarah's voice calling to me from my dreams. She tells me about the cool, dark place where there's no hunger because you become the hunger, where the prairie keeps what the prairie claims. And sometimes, when I'm feeling particularly weak or lonely, I almost want to answer. I almost want to drive back to that rebuilt clearing and find whatever new well has opened in the limestone, whatever new family is waiting to welcome travelers who've taken the wrong turn down a dirt road that leads nowhere. But then I remember the way Sarah's face had melted in the firelight, the sound the homesteader children made when they dissolved into ash and shadow. I remember that some hungers are never satisfied, that some families never let their children leave home. The Flint Hills are beautiful in autumn, when the prairie grass turns gold and the limestone ridges catch the last light of evening. But beauty can hide terrible things, and not every clearing in the tall grass is a safe place to make camp. Some places are meant to be avoided, some roads are meant to be left untraveled, and some fires, once started, burn forever in the dark places beneath the earth, where the hungry wait and the lost are found, where the prairie keeps what the prairie claims. I still live in Kansas, but I never drive south of Council Grove. I never take dirt roads that lead away from the highway, and I never, ever go camping with coworkers who might suggest we find a remote clearing where we can disconnect from the world. Because some disconnections are permanent, and some places in the wilderness aren't empty at all. They're full of families who are always looking for new members to join them in the cool, dark ground, where the thirsty earth drinks more than just the morning rains.